40 here. So great news. Last night I decided to become an expert on Iran. One of the most cited, most praised, most referenced books right now about Iran is called Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. It's published by an academic named Vali Nasr and came out last year. And so I'm listening to it on Audible, all eager to become an Iran expert. And he talks about how Iran is this growing power in the Middle East with this increasingly dominant axis of resistance, how the United States is exhausted and looking to exit the Middle East, which is just hilarious. It's just the very opposite of what's going on now. And I think it points to a much bigger issue, and that is claims of expertise. And expertise in international relations is not the same as expertise in biology or in some hard science. It functions much more like journalism. It functions much more like astrology. Why do people turn to astrology? Because they find comfort from it. And sovereigns throughout history have often turned to people who could provide them comfort. And so international relations doesn't seem to have that much predictive value. Instead, what it seems to do is create a narrative after the fact. And I think looking at international relations and the IR experts through the frame of how much of this is just astrology, how much of this is just people acting as diviners and pretending that they're able to read what's going on. I don't have a position on the Iran war, whether it's good or bad, because it's too complicated, too many variables. It's beyond my scope of understanding. But I am able to see nonsense, and all these IR experts making grand pronouncements. That's fine if you've got an impressive track record, but very few of them do have an impressive track record. So let's get clear that there are many levels of expertise, and some forms of expertise are much more valuable than other forms. Right, you got a plumbing problem that you don't know how to fix, and you pay a plumber to come over and fix your plumbing problem. That's a type of expertise that is valuable. If you have important tech developments or software developments or medical developments that save lives or make lives easier or revolutionize the economy, that is a valuable type of expertise. But it sure feels like most of the people making grand pronouncements about the Middle East right now are really good at making theatrical grand pronouncements, but not so good at conveying important truths. Not that I have important truths about what's going to happen in Iran, but I'm able to spot the nonsense. All right, my life may be a failure, but at least I see through the BS. And so I want to run through some of the leading cliches about what's happening in the Iran war right now. And because I'm not pro-war or anti-war, I'm able to stand back a little easier and give you my disinterested opinion on what's happening. I do have alliances. Most of my friends are probably American nationalists. I'm a Zionist, right? I believe that Jews benefit from the application of nationalism just like any other group. And I came to the United States in 1977, and soon after, Iran became a major thorn in the side of America. And I'll admit, I have a visceral repulsion against the Iranian Islamist regime because they've killed so many Americans. And so emotionally, I feel great that they're getting pounded right now. But due to all the possible things that might happen, I don't need to take a position. But if you just, I think looking at this objectively, the American-Israeli attack on Iran has been incredibly successful. Beyond the wildest dreams of someone who supports the war. There haven't been any American casualties, to the best of my knowledge, in a week. In a week. No American casualties, only 6 American casualties overall. And there's only, to the best of my knowledge, been about 3 Israeli casualties in the past week. And that's interesting because I heard that Iran was incredibly formidable. As I was becoming an Iran expert, reading about Iran's grand strategy, I thought that Iran would have much more capacity to kill Americans and to kill Israelis than it does. And it sure seems like the axis of resistance is on the back foot. And Vali Nasr, in his book Iran's Grand Strategy, portrays Iran's proxy network as unstoppable, that Iran had built the most powerful non-state alliance system in the Middle East, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraqi militias, Syrian regime, Houthis. But doesn't seem to have turned out that way. I mean, Hamas has been decimated. Hezbollah has been decimated. Syria's pro-Iran regime collapsed. And so the axis of resistance and Iran looks fragile. The whole Iranian deterrence aura has completely cracked. That America and Israel now have complete dominance in the air. The regional balance of power has flipped much faster than expected. Israel has regained the military initiative. Arab states are hedging away from Tehran. It's a completely different system than what these experts said. So Vali Nasr, John Hopkins professor, senior advisor to Richard Holbrooke in the State Department, frequent contributor to foreign affairs and other elite policy forums. Right, he's right in the middle of the foreign policy establishment, the blob. And they hate this war. They criticize it for being incoherent. And what's the end game? Because if Trump operating on his gut produces a more effective foreign policy than what the foreign policy establishment has been able to produce, then that must be absolutely devastating for their status. Right? The brave soldiers right now are not just those fighting on behalf of America and Israel. They are the endless. They are the live streamers like me who are offering our opinions and competing for status on who can most accurately decode what's happening in this war.
Maybe more casualties to come. Earlier in the day in Doral, the president hosted leaders of 12 Latin American countries at the Shield of the Americas summit to strengthen U.S. influence in the region. He also called out Cuba once again, saying it is in its last moments of life. Here at home, gas prices continue to rise as the price of oil now hits $90 a barrel. The president has not said if he will tap the strategic petroleum reserves, but says prices will come down once this conflict is over.
There's a lot of oil. We've got a lot of oil. Our country has a tremendous amount, and there's a lot of oil out there. That'll get healed very quickly.
The president has now, Mike, ruled out sending in Kurdish fighters. He told reporters yesterday that it would only complicate matters even more. As for U.S. troops, he won't say either way. He's keeping that close to the vest, not saying one way or another if that is going to happen. Mike?
Aisha Hasni live in sunny Doral. Aisha, thanks very much.
Thanks.
For more now, let's bring in former Air Force intelligence officer Jake Sotiriadis. Jake, welcome.
Good to see you, Mike.
So as an old Air Force guy, what do you make of the careful coordination between the United States Air Force and the Israeli Air Force in this complicated mission in Iran?
Well, Mike, I think it's nothing short of amazingly impressive. If you look at the sheer number of targets that have been taken out since the beginning of operations, the close coordination between the American and Israeli militaries, but also a real shout out to the brave men and women of the American intelligence community who are working behind the scenes to be able to pick targets, to identify critical nodes. And now you're seeing the campaign move into a phase of targeting critical infrastructure. I might say, though, we do have a little bit of a dilemma moving forward in that we are not striking, or the real goal is not to just decimate Iran's military. We are actually fighting Iran's ideological power network. And that means the network between the population elites and institutions within Iran that has been entrenched for over 40 years. And so the question is, to what extent can these strikes apply enough pressure to disrupt or fracture elements of that network so that we can get to our desired objectives?
Jake, as you know, there's a debate over whether U.S. boots on the ground will be needed. What are the limits of air power?
Mike, this is really the critical question right now. Obviously, the air campaign thus far, the military campaign, has been very, very effective. We've struck an amazing number of targets.
One of the less useful cliches we're hearing about this war is the limits of air power. We really don't know what the limits of air power are, given that we have a whole new level of air power now, including drones. And so what Israel and the United States can do with quote-unquote air power that now includes drone is not knowable. And so that there is no inherent reason to limit the effectiveness of what air power can create right
Iran's Navy has been pretty much taken off the map. The question now becomes, if you look at historical examples, air attacks alone, air power alone has not historically led to regime change. You can go all the way back to World War II, to the combined bomber offensive, where cities like Dresden that were firebombed did not result in either the regime surrendering or the population giving up. So this is part of the calculus that needs to be taken into account when we think about the continued phases of the campaign. Will air power alone, will attacks from the air be able to break up that network that I talked about, exert enough pressure on the regime without having to use ground forces? And of course, we're seeing that the ground force option is not being taken off the table. It's not being discussed very, very much, but it's certainly something that's going to be in the calculus over the next week.
So Vali Nasr is an academic, a major expert on this war. I'm listening to his book on Audible, and his book hasn't aged very well.
The Iranian threat is essentially aimed at downgrading or destroying the Iranian state.
Right.
And President Trump also similarly said yesterday that it will take Iran 10 years just to build back. So it is a campaign that is not directed at military targets. It's directed at state and society. And that's a bit surprising that the U.S. has embarked on this kind of a war after it said that it was done with these kinds of wars in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. You said at the outset that the war, you believe, now seems to be aimed at dismantling or decimating the Iranian state as we know it. Do you believe that the Iranian state, the Islamic State of Iran that was set up, this Islamic Republic in 1979, can this present regime of the Ayatollahs be dismantled so easily? Do you see that happening? Is it now fighting an existential war for its own survival? Is that how you see it?
Yes, it is. And not just in a way, not just.
So his book came out and said that Iran was dominating the Middle East as America was withdrawing because America was so exhausted. And he was describing the elite consensus from about 2011 to 2024. So that elite consensus has completely collapsed. So for 15 years, the dominant view in Washington among the elites that America was strategically exhausted by the Middle East and it needed to pivot to Asia. Right? You ever heard of the term pivot to Asia? Well, instead, we've pivoted to South America and we've pivoted to the Middle East. And the international relations experts aren't doing too well, right? They look pretty ridiculous with their claims that America was leaving the Middle East and that Iran's proxy system was dominant. Now the war has completely decimated their analysis. And when you hear these IR experts, they sound so impressive, and I absolutely accept that they do have some valuable expertise, but trying to disentangle their expertise from the nonsense, the grandstanding, the astrology and divining that they're engaged in is the challenge. And so international relations, it feels a lot more like journalism, like astrology, like divining, rather than any useful expertise. And a lot of people in the field agree with me, right? It looks like astrology with footnotes. It does not have a great track record. Virtually no IR experts, including John Mearsheimer, predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Arab Spring, Russia invading Ukraine in 2022, October 7, or the current Iran war escalation. So what these international relations experts offer is not accurate predictions, right? They offer narratives. They offer stories that are useful to people with money and power. They create these structures of thinking about what's going on in the world. So I remember when in 1988 I came down with what felt like the flu, but then it went on month after month after month. And a year later, when I got a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, it felt so relieving. It just took all this tension and worry and concern and dissipated it, because at least now I had a narrative, now I had a name, now I had a diagnosis. And that's what international relations provides to people with power and money. It gives them a way of thinking about what's happening that may or may not be accurate. So chronic fatigue syndrome may not have been what was ailing me, but that I had a name for it, that I had a narrative, that I had a way to understand what was happening really helped me, whether or not it was true. And so there are just so many variables when people do things like go to war that clean models of international relations don't really work out very well. IR experts are trying to infer intentions from thin evidence, and the field has these strong career incentives for making grand theories. Right? Saying this is unpredictable does not get you tenure or a book contract. Producing sweeping frameworks does. Right? The field relies heavily on personal judgment disguised as expertise and formal theory. Right? They build all these mental models from their years of reading and their abilities to recognize patterns, and then they wrap their feelings in academic language. They remind me a lot of philosophers who seem to often start out with their own feelings about reality and then look for fancy academic ways of phrasing that. Now, IR has some modest use. Right? It can explain, for example, why nuclear states avoid direct war, why weaker states rely on proxies, why sanctions often fail to topple regimes, why authoritarian regimes fall when elites defect. Right? What it does not do well is timing. So perhaps it works better like seismology than astrology. Experts in geology are not particularly effective at predicting earthquakes. But after the earthquake happens, then they can explain what happened. So IR experts and geologists, talking about experts, they do have some expertise with the structure, right? Iran's proxy network, or Israel's intolerance for a nuclear breakout by Iran, or the shadow war between US and Iran, or the deterrence factor. Right? But they're not very good at predicting specific chains of events that produce a crisis. So IR experts tend to drift into storytelling.
The regime, but also the country is fighting an existential war. One may think that, that sounds an exaggeration, but the Iranians are worried about a scenario like Syria, in other words, complete chaos, disorder, state failure. When President Trump says he's going to arm Kurdish forces to fight separatist battles in Iran, most Iranians have memories of the 19th century when the large parts of Iran broke off under British and Russian pressure, and then Iran was occupied and almost lost its northern provinces to Stalin's army. So these ideas of disintegration of Iran are not theoretical to Iranians. And so they see, and also the state.
So let's go to the chat. If this is just and good for Jews to do, meaning the state of Israel has gone to war with Iran, then why do Jews condemn what the Nazis did? Well, Jews would say the Nazis didn't go to war with a particular nation when they launched the Holocaust. They were going to war with civilians. If might makes right, then don't complain when might is used on you. Everybody justifies and comes up with rationalizations and explanations for why their tribe is correct and other tribes, their enemies, are evil. So the enemies of Jews do this, Israel does this, Iran does this, Democrats, Republicans, every tribe, every group has all these numerous rationalizations and narratives for why their particular group is righteous and other groups are unrighteous. So there's nothing particularly Jewish about this. We did not evolve to seek global truths. There's no evolutionary reproductive advantage usually in seeking global truths unless it leads to increased status, which leads to increased resources, which then confer a reproductive advantage. But other than that, we are evolved to live in a tribe and to make arguments about why our tribe is great and why our enemies are horrible. So those are the incentives that are embedded in our genetics by millions of years of evolution. And these incentives operate just as much on Jews as they do on non-Jews.
Even beyond the regime in Iran is essentially a structure embedded in Iranian society and the nation state. So degradation of the state is different from decapitation of the regime.
Right.
So when you go after hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, yesterday a stadium was destroyed in Iran, then that's essentially...
So one thing that IR experts, international relations experts, offer that is probably a useful frame on when does a regime crack and collapse, it's when there is dissension among its elites. And right now, there's apparently very little evidence that the Iranian regime is cracking. That seems that on the ground, that the regime supporters are still operating, they're still reigning, they still keep the people in check. But when it happens, when the Iranian regime does collapse, if it does collapse, it will happen very rapidly. There's no way that this Islamist regime will hold on indefinitely, because most of the people of Iran hate it. So when you've got 80% of the population opposed to you, there are severe limits on how long you can last.
Because in my opinion, we are very much in the beginning phases of this campaign, and I think it's going to last a long time longer.
Democrats have their criticisms. I want to play a clip from Senator Chris Murphy, and I will get you to react to it.
This is already a war that is becoming an ongoing disaster. It gets worse if the president is talking about putting ground forces in, talking at that point about dozens, if not hundreds of new Americans.
So there's a comment in the chat on Rumble right now that we're in a perpetual war. Well, we've been in a undeclared war with Iran since 1979. They took Americans hostage. They've killed over 1,000 Americans. They funded, trained, supported, and directed Hezbollah to blow up a Marines barracks in 1983 that killed over 250 Americans. So this Iranian Islamist regime is responsible for over 1,000 American casualties. So we've had an undeclared war going on with Iran for a long time. Now the war has been made explicit.
American casualties. If you don't actually succeed in putting a new leader inside that country, they'll just be able to rebuild that capacity as soon as American forces are gone. So this is $1 billion waste of money every single day.
In your view, is there any reason for that level of pessimism?
Look, Mike, I think we need to be very circumspect here. We are very much, this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of military operations. We have many, many more phases of the campaign that are going to unfold. We haven't yet seen the extent to which the real pressure that is being exerted on the Iranian regime.
So when I got that diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, I loved it. It was very valuable for me. It made me feel better. And that didn't have anything to do with it being true. Right? It just felt true. And so what IR scholars like Vali Nasr do is they provide stories, narratives that feel true to people who have power and money. And if a story feels true to people with power and money, then you create shared mental maps. So you have thousands of disparate members of the blob, America's foreign policy establishment, bureaucrats, generals, diplomats, who can then share a story and share a mental map. And this does not depend on the map being accurate. It depends on the map being popular among elites. Now, Vali Nasr's mental map has failed, right? His model for how Iran operated has not worked out, right? The very opposite of what he was saying in his widely praised book has occurred, right? He said that the United States was exhausted and was leaving the Middle East, and that the Iranian proxy network was dominant and Iran was a rising power. And none of this is true. So you'd think it'd be humiliating. You'd think he would have a little bit more humility than what he seems to exhibit right now. Here he is.
It's larger. And I think, yes, the country is now geared towards existential moment, largely because it's also facing two qualitatively superior militaries. And so it's an underdog's fight against much more overwhelming power.
Professor.
So because the record of these IR experts is so mixed, so weak, many people prefer ex-intelligence people like Amos Yadlin, former IDF, or Avi Malamed, someone else connected with Israel. Their analysis is carrying a lot more weight than pure academics right now because they have much more real-world experience. And I think this frame of astrology diviner is a pretty useful one for IR, because we heard for 15 years about the pivot to Asia, and it's just like the dominant astrological sign for the American foreign policy establishment between, say, 2011 and 2024. Right. Their stories, their theories, their mental maps about what's happening haven't mapped very closely to reality, but they've been popular in the foreign policy establishment. You don't need to be right to be popular. Now, the information market is undergoing a massive correction. Academics like this bloke Nasr, who argued for the stability and power of the Iranian regime, they are seeing their prestige stock plummet. And other analysts like, say, Afshan Ostavar, who focuses on the Iranian regime's military ideology, and Fazeen Nadimi, who focuses on Iran's hardware, their status is going up and up and up because their prestige is at an all-time high, because their mental maps, their tactical maps, seem to match very closely with what's really going on in this war. So can the U.S. sustain its interceptor rate? Right? Is the Iranian population still deterred by the Muslim leaders? Does Iran have the power to outlast America and Israel? So the axis of resistance that this bloke Nasr describes seems to be falling apart. And so where else will people look for analysis and narratives that match reality? They're not going so much to
right now is going to take effect. There could be, over the next weeks, a true desire to come to the table and see if there can be some sort of a solution reached. That is going to be very difficult, though, because, again, as I've mentioned, if you're not able to break up that ideological power network, if you aren't able to exert enough pressure on the regime exclusively through air attacks, it is going to demand another solution. President Trump, as we've heard, has taken the option of using Kurdish resistance fighters off the table. The question is now, can the United States activate the resistance within Iran, the anti-regime resistance, through intelligence support, through perhaps arming them? That's not something that happens overnight. It's going to take time. And so I think right now we need to watch and see how effective the maximum.
So I love the buffered versus porous identity distinction. So if you have a buffered identity, that's the modern, educated, post-Enlightenment identity, then you believe that the most important things in life are inside of you. You get to decide right and wrong. You get to decide what is success. You get to strategically, autonomously, rationally choose your path in life. And this is the point of view of the highly educated, of the modern, of the elite, as opposed to a traditional tribalist, nationalist, religious perspective on life, which holds to the porous identity, where the most important things in life are outside of you. The standards of right and wrong are outside of you. The standards of what constitutes a good and honorable life are outside of you. And so, therefore, your most important responsibility is to live up to these external standards. While when you have the buffered identity, the most important thing in life is to follow your bliss, to figure out what you believe to be right and wrong. And so the elite tend to this buffered identity. And so that's why rationality and coherence and a rhetoric that seems rational is just so important to them. Now, I was born in 1966. I'm 59 years of age. And I remember in the run-up to the 1991 Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that the dominant media frame was this was going to be a disaster, that Iraq had a formidable military force, that this would create thousands of American casualties, and then the coalition led by America just rolled over the Iraqi military, just decimated them. So in the run-up to the first Gulf War, the elite press was highly skeptical of military intervention. The Vietnam experience, the American humiliation in Vietnam still dominated elite thinking, and so journalists did not want to come across as cheerleaders for the war, and instead they over-focused skepticism and criticism of the President Bush administration's plans and strategy. That the war ends quickly with a decisive American victory, and so the elites and the news media recalibrated. They said, we were too hostile, too critical of the president's war aims. And so when 9/11 comes along and President Bush says we're at war with terror, the news media was quite different, right? The shock of 9/11, this overwhelming elite consensus in Washington that we had to go to war now in the Middle East, and the desire not to appear unpatriotic reduced the level of adversarial scrutiny, and major elite outlets such as the New York Times accepted claims at face value by the Bush administration about Iraq's dangerous weapons of mass destruction, and they gave an overwhelmingly positive framing to the Bush administration's desire to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq and to occupy both countries. And then these wars turned out to be disastrous, and journalists and elites concluded, well, we failed to challenge the government enough. We failed to be sufficiently critical. We failed to be sufficiently adversarial. And so in that trauma, the news media leans into coverage of the Iran war, perhaps from an overly cautious, overly skeptical, overly adversarial frame. If this Iran war turns out to be a quick, clean victory for the United States, then they'll have to recalibrate again. So it's not just generals always fighting the last war. It sure looks like even our elites are fighting the last war in the way they try to understand things. So when you have that elite, buffered, professional perspective, right, words matter. Rhetoric matters. International law matters. The words and rhetoric are causal. I follow the news and I wonder, mate, why do you give so much weight and importance to President Trump's words? People rarely say what they mean. They rarely mean what they say. And it's just hilarious the way the news media takes every pronouncement from Donald Trump on a literal basis. Did you see the Netflix TV show Black Mirror? In the first episode, terrorists seize England's princess, Suzanne, I think, and they demand, in exchange for her release, that the prime minister on live TV have sexual relations with a pig. And he eventually has to go through with it. And so I was just thinking, what if President Trump said that he intended to have relations with the dead body of the Ayatollah Khomeini, right? How would the news media treat that? They treat it very seriously and literally, and they bewail how we've gotten away from international norms, and it's an absolute scandal. When blokes just like to blow off steam. I mean, who hasn't talked about something outrageous that you would never do in real life?
Pressure campaign that is being exerted right now will be, but I think the ground troops discussion is not done. It's one that we are going to have, and it's one that's going to be relevant moving forward in the next weeks and months.
Jake, what do you make of the use of relatively inexpensive drones in this conflict? And is the future of warfare here now?
Well, look, we definitely are seeing an unprecedented level of drones play a key role in this conflict on both sides, right? This is what the United States has been using. They were used in last Saturday's attack that took out the.
So one media cliche that I think is particularly bogus right now is that Trump hasn't explained the necessity for this war. We have been in a quiet war with Iran for 50 years. Trump, I think, has made the point very clearly that we need to devastate Iran's capabilities to create massive trouble, such as with nuclear arms, with ballistic missiles, with support for terrorists. So to me, the case for this war is crystal clear.
Supreme leader. It is a new modicum of warfare, and we're seeing, of course, the Iranians do considerable damage to both civilian and military infrastructure throughout the Middle East region and even beyond, where you had Iranian drones land at the British base in Akrotiri on Cyprus. And so, yes, we are living through a transformational period of warfare. The question will be, do these systems in and of themselves, are they able to generate the kind of strategic effects to actually transform the situation on the battlefield? Right now, at a tactical level, we're seeing them very, very effective. But if you look at Russia and Ukraine, of course, they've been trading thousands and thousands of drone attacks on both sides. That's very much a war of attrition. We need to keep our eyes on what's happening in Iran to see if this will also become a war of attrition over the next weeks and months.
Based on talking to Democrats and Republicans this week and experts on modern American history, is there's one thing that I don't think needs to be debated, and that's why did the president do this and why now? I don't think that's
This is a really good point by Mark Halperin. I think he nails it. He's absolutely clear. I think this is fair. And I think Halperin, once again, is right. And the elite mainstream media is wrong.
Ambiguous. It's cast as ambiguous. I even hear from some Republicans who support this effort. They need better answers to that. I don't think we do. And the reason I'm focusing on this is the focus on that debate. Why did he do it and why now? Obscures the conversations about these other issues. And these other issues, I think, are debatable. They are ripe for national conversation. The question of why and why now has been set back at times by the administration itself. By Secretary Rubio, for instance, saying, why now? Because Israel was going to attack Iran, which would have led Iran to attack the United States, and that meant the U.S. had to strike first. That was kind of walked back. I don't think that answers the why now question. So some of this unnecessary debate has been brought on by the administration itself. And, of course, the president himself, in his various pronouncements here, has not always been disciplined. And so to the extent they're frustrated, as I am, that the debate about why and why now continues, they've brought some of it on themselves. But I don't think it requires much looking at what's been said in the last few days since this began, or recent history, to understand the why and the why now. So let's talk about it. Most cleanly, Caroline Leavitt, at her daily briefing on Wednesday, read the list of why and why now. Here's Caroline Leavitt from the White House briefing on Wednesday. S3, please.
At the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, launched last weekend, President Trump laid out clear objectives to the American people on what the U.S. military seeks to accomplish through these major combat operations. Number one, destroy the regime's deadly ballistic missiles and completely raze their missile industry to the ground. Number two, annihilate the Iranian regime's navy. And so far, we have destroyed more than 20 Iranian ships, including their top submarine last night, using a torpedo for the first time since World War II. There is not a single Iranian ship underway in the Arabian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, or the Gulf of Oman. Number three, Operation Epic Fury will ensure the regime's terrorist proxies in the region can no longer destabilize the region or the free world and attack our armed forces. And thus far, Iran's proxies are hardly putting up a fight. Number four, this mission will guarantee that Iran can never obtain a nuclear weapon.
Okay, that laid out very clearly from the...
Yes, I think Halperin is right. The Trump administration's reason for going to war are quite clear. Let's have a look at the chat. I don't think that 9/11 truthers are onto anything, but I understand that they create exciting stories, but they don't create stories that have much grounding in fact. I don't believe that this war has absolutely anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein. Donald Trump has been quite hostile towards Iran since the 1970s. He has supported the use of American military force to humiliate Iran since the 1970s. Donald Trump has been skeptical of free trade since the 1970s. There are some things that Donald Trump does believe in. Did I search my name in the Epstein files? I did, and I do not show up there. And no, I don't believe there is going to be a nuke. I don't believe that we're going to nuke Iran. I think, according to what I've read, there's about a 30% chance that Iran will try to detonate a dirty bomb. So a type of low-level nuclear bomb. Yes, I think Iran might do it. So to understand how different people are experiencing this war, go back to the buffered versus porous identity. So when you are porous, you recognize the most important things in life are outside of you, and you recognize that there are a great deal of danger. There's a great deal of danger in the world, and that Iran poses danger through its support for terrorism. But our elites and our leading institutions are all run by people with the buffered identity, right? They believe that the world is run by reason, by procedure, by reflection, and that what happens in the world is primarily shaped by ideas, by words, by rhetoric, by argument, by logic, and by decisions made through rational deliberation, rather than by actions taken out of genetic or tribal necessity. And so our elite institutions are all built around this psychological model. The academy, law, journalism, diplomacy, political analysis, all operate from the perspective of the buffered identity, and that words, therefore, and rhetoric is incredibly important. And you gain prestige in these elite institutions by writing, speaking, debating, and producing rational perspectives on the world. And so if you get status through the coherence and logic and power of your words, it's natural to assume that rhetoric and logic and words are the primary drivers of reality. And I don't think they are. Right? I don't think that careful language and careful reasoning is the primary power in the world. So this explains why the elite and the news media, and the New York Times and the Financial Times, they're fixated on terms like reckless rhetoric, dangerous language, strategic signaling, dialogue, narrative, because in their identity, in their ecosystem, these words are incredibly important because their reputations, their alliances, their policy positions are all developed and negotiated through this type of language. But outside of this elite environment, people tend to understand reality based much more on power, on loyalty, on tribe, on identity, fear, honor, and all sorts of material incentives. So there's a massive gap between the elite Buffett interpretation of reality and the way most people experience reality. Elites treat Donald Trump's rhetoric as causal. I think a normal person recognizes that it's not rhetoric that runs the world. My father did a PhD in rhetoric. My father was very good at rhetoric, but rhetoric does not run the world. Now, language serves a practical function from an evolutionary perspective in that it is a signal. So it helps us to coordinate with members of our team. But admitting that language has its point, that language has use, that language has its power, doesn't mean that language runs the world, right? Power runs the world. The strong do what they want, and the weak must endure what they must. So the blob, the foreign policy establishment, the elites, they hate populist nationalism. They hate the irrational and dangerous rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration because the nationalists, the populists, the tribalists ignores their Buffett rules for international diplomacy. Right? We see the blob as detached, outside of reality, bloodless, relying on models that don't reflect reality. Right? The blob is all about the symmetry of formal treaties and international law, while the normie, he looks at the world through the friend-enemy distinction, and he recognizes the need for a president to make decisive decisions to protect the group. So the blob wants to manage Iran through incremental pressure and have experts lead the way. They want precise, coherent logic. Populists want the Iranian problem dealt with, and if a decisive act of power, if American-Israeli bombing will deal with this problem, then fine. So from the Buffett elite perspective, the United States is protected by massive oceans and a massive military, and Iran is not really much of a threat. But from a trad perspective, a tribal and nationalist perspective, right, we see Iran supporting terror and wreaking havoc all around the world. Iran feels much more of a threat. When you're porous, when you recognize that the outside world can overcome the strongest of your intentions, then you have a keener sense of your vulnerability, and therefore a keener, more immediate response to outside threats such as Iran.
From the podium by the president's spokesperson, their Navy, their terror capacity, their missile capacity, their nuclear capacity. Very clear. Okay? But you got to go back further to understand the why. Donald Trump, almost 50 years ago, in a television interview, product of his times. If you were an adult during the Iranian hostage crisis at the end of the Carter administration, you look at Iran as an evil country. You look at the leaders of Iran as radical extremists, religious fundamentalists who want to do damage to the United States. And if you're like Donald Trump, you look at them as someone who humiliated, embarrassed, went to war with the United States by taking Americans hostage, and you never forgot it. Here's Donald Trump talking about his feelings about Iran and the hostage.
So I was about 14, 15 during the Iran hostage crisis, and I have pretty much the same reaction as Trump.
Crisis. In an interview with Rona Barrett, 1980, S7, please.
When you get the respect of the other countries, then the other countries tend to do a little bit as you do, and you can create the right attitudes. The Iranian situation is a case in point. That they hold our hostages is just absolutely and totally ridiculous that this country sits back and allows a country such as Iran to hold our hostages, to my way of thinking, is a horror. And I don't think they'd do it with other countries.
Obviously, you're
There are very strong arguments against Donald Trump in general, many of his policies. There are very strong arguments against the Iran war. It is not a strong argument to say that Trump hasn't explained why we are at war with Iran.
Advocating that we should have gone in there with troops, etc., and brought our boys out.
I absolutely feel that, yes. I don't think there's any question, and there's no question in my mind. I think right now would be an oil-rich nation, and I believe that we should have done it, and I'm very disappointed that we didn't do it, and I don't think anybody would have held us in abeyance. I don't think anybody would have been angry with us, and we had every right to do it at the time.
There are things about Donald Trump that are inconsistent and shambolic, right? But the issues that Donald Trump ran for president on in 2016, 2020, and 2024 are almost entirely issues he talked about all the way back almost 50 years ago, 1980. Okay? Since 1980, maybe earlier, but since 1980, Donald Trump's had a very clear view about Iran. They're an evil country, and the only way to deal with them is with force. Okay? So that lays the predicate to say why? Because Donald Trump believes that you cannot allow the Iranians to walk over the United States or threaten the United States.
Notice Mark Halperin using the word predicate, right? Unnecessarily complicated, fancy word there. Why do elites love these fancy, highfalutin terms like predicate? I want to get into that. But first, think back to the Second Gulf War, 2003. The stated pretext was to find and destroy Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Now, the stated pretext for things is not usually the true reason, right? There's the real reason that people do things, and then there is the stated reason. So we did not primarily go to war in Iraq in 2003 to find and destroy Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. That argument was politically useful, but the Bush administration wasn't so stupid as to invade on that basis. They just put that argument forward. And so when we assess whether or not it was a good idea to invade and occupy Iraq in 2003 for the next 7 years after that, I don't think we need to do it primarily on the basis of, did the Bush administration's rhetoric and logic, was it fulfilled by events? No. The primary question should be, did this action serve American interests? And I don't think it did. The problem with the occupation and invasion was not that we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. The problem with this Bush action was not that it wasn't logically and rationally and rhetorically coherent. The problem was it did not fulfill American interests. Elites put way too much importance on words, on logic, and rhetoric, right? Because they use rhetoric as a tool of mobilization within their social class, right? To create a symmetry between their members of their particular tribe. But power, blind power, and facts on the ground, to me, are much more important than the rhetoric and the coherence and the philosophy and the beauty of the words. Moral language can be quite useful to coordinate your group, to coordinate your tribe, but we should not get confused between the signal, the moral language, and the reality. This moral language is a way to organize the tribe. It's not reality. The map is a reflection of reality. The map is not reality itself.
In every one of his presidential campaigns, you can find plenty of examples of where Donald Trump made it clear Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. Combining a nuclear power with an evil power was intolerable for the United States. Here's one. We could show you clips from all three of his presidential campaigns, but here's one from his 2020 race when he was running for re-election. This is S9, please.
As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning.
Okay, so that was Donald Trump's position. Since he's been on the national stage as a politician over 11 years now, Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. That's the why.
So here's another tiresome cliche dominating elite discourse. Elites love the word discourse, and the New York Times and Financial Times. And that is how horrible it was that Donald Trump encouraged Iranians to revolt against their government in January of this year, and how horrible it was that President Herbert Walker Bush in 1991 encouraged Iraqis and Kurds to revolt against Saddam Hussein. A president's words should not be and cannot accurately, realistically be described as the prime mover in why people decide to do things. If Iranians poured out onto the street to protest the regime, it wasn't because Donald Trump told them to do so. If Donald Trump told them to go suck off a dog, would they go suck off a dog? And elites put, once again, way too much emphasis on the power of words. Right? If your boss tells you to do something ridiculous, you don't lose all agency. Right? These protesters took action because that's what they wanted to do. And then if they blame President Bush or they blame President Donald Trump, that's because it's always easier to blame someone else than to take responsibility. So if your girlfriend or your mother or your father tells you to do something and you're above the age of 15, or certainly if you're above the age of 18, you should decide on the basis of your own incentives whether or not you want to do something. So I think the elite and the foreign policy professionals tend to overestimate the power of words and signals from presidents because their entire world revolves around interpreting signals, interpreting words, interpreting rhetoric. But if you live outside that particular professional bubble, you recognize that there are far more important things in the world usually than rhetoric.
But it's not a weird position of Donald Trump. Every one of the people who've been president preceding Donald Trump has had the exact same point of view. Here are Donald Trump's three predecessors, and in the case of Joe Biden, predecessor and successor, talking about their view of whether Iran should be allowed to have nuclear weapons. This is number S6, please.
The idea of Iran having a nuclear weapon is unacceptable.
I strongly believe that our national security interest now depends upon preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
Iran will never get a nuclear weapon on my watch, as they say.
Okay, so Bush, Obama, Biden, same thing. They can't have nuclear weapons. Now, none of them, in an attempt to keep Iran from having nuclear weapons, did this kind of operation that we see now. They tried to sanction them. In the case of Barack Obama, they tried to negotiate a deal with them. So
the more educated someone is, the more they love the word dialogue. You notice how much elites just love the word dialogue, right? Why? What does it do for them, right? It shows that you're part of a prestigious class. It shows that you are civilized, that you are morally elevated. You say, we need dialogue, and it places you on the side of reason and patience and maturity. And it implies that people who oppose dialogue are emotional, tribal, and reckless. So the word carries a built-in moral hierarchy. We are on the side of the angels. You are on the side of the devil. Second, it protects elite authority. So dialogue implies a managed conversation between responsible actors. And usually dialogue is fake because people don't usually say what they mean or mean what they say. Dialogue presents a disinterested perspective, that you're not taking sides, right? It sounds very objective and constructive, and it doesn't commit you to anything, right? You can just call for dialogue, and it doesn't exact anything from you. When you use dialogue, it reflects the culture of your particular class. It manages your institution. It flatters your group's self-image. Right? It is a symbol of your professional class. So that's why this word appears constantly in elite rhetoric. We need strategic dialogue, constructive dialogue, regional dialogue, dialogue between stakeholders, right? The word sounds humane, responsible, and sophisticated, and it leaves the real distribution of power untouched. So elites get to continue to rule. Let's bring Michael back onto the show. Michael, what's going on, man?
40 boy, how are you?
I am blessed. How are you?
Good. Yeah, so a lot of news since we last spoke. Yeah, I saw someone in the chat mention unconditional surrender, and it's like, I really think we painted ourselves into a corner. Why would you say unconditional surrender? You're making the other side completely desperate, completely without any other recourse than to just fight to the death.
So I agree. Like, it does not seem to be aligned with America's best interests. But how seriously should we take these pronouncements? I don't think the words and the rhetoric is that important. I think that if Trump was able to reach a deal today that was not an unconditional surrender, Trump would reach a deal today if it reflected what he sees as America's interests. It's just a part of a barrage of words put out by Trump and his administration that are not equivalent to reality. Right? These are just words, and words not the most important part of reality.
Hopefully not. Hopefully you're right. Although, the problem is just a perception that the words create, like, independent of whether he actually means it or not.
Well, words only create a perception if the person chooses to perceive them a certain way. So if you told me to do something ridiculous, it wouldn't have any effect on me. I wouldn't go do it, and I wouldn't blame you for telling me to go do something ridiculous. Words only have the importance that you assign to them. So people get to make a choice. I simply don't think Trump's words are that important. I virtually never choose to listen to a politician. Trump probably more than most, but almost never do I want to hear the words of a politician because I just don't get any value there. They are among the least interested in truth.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but diplomacy in and of itself is basically using words. So I think it would be nice to just blithely kind of wave away the words and the meaning implied in the words. But you would also have to say that, granted that Trump is known to change his mind and say things and then do another thing. But even given all that, it's a little worrying that he would use that or he would make that demand.
Well, it's only worrying if you take it literally and you see it as co-equal with reality. I don't find it worrying. I don't find it co-equal with reality. Diplomacy uses words, but there are forces in diplomacy that are far more powerful than words, and that's real-world power. So when your forces have been decimated, then it's the situation that is the overwhelming force in diplomacy, and words are just a signal to get things done. But it's not the words that are primarily creating reality. It's the facts on the ground, is the situation.
I got you. I mean, but just moving on, the reason it's worrying is because you would want to give them an off-ramp, a way to save face. I don't think unconditional surrender is probably not like a realistic demand to make on a country as big and strong as Iran. So I think that was the beauty of the Venezuela action, was that Trump was all about giving them an off-ramp, but now he's doing the opposite. And it's like very disappointing.
Well, he said so many opposite things with regard to Venezuela. He said, we're running the country now. He said all sorts of equally ridiculous, detached from reality things about Venezuela. I don't think that that there's much of a difference. And do you agree with me that most people don't say what they mean and most people don't mean what they say?
Yes, but I think it's not about authenticity. It's about as you say, it's about the situation. And it would have been, I have to think someone else put that idea in his head, like we need unconditional surrender. Also, but just moving on from that particular aspect of it, what was I going to say? Okay. So I know we've been at war with Iran for 47 years, supposedly, but wouldn't it have been good to wait for when and if they would actually attack us rather than this rather than this ridiculous excuse that Marco Rubio gave for the attack?
Again, you put far more emphasis on rationality, logic, coherence, and putting together a platform or a structure that sounds good as opposed to real-world results. If an attack that sounds incoherent and is say, more difficult to rhetorically justify is more effective than an attack that is logically and rhetorically coherent and philosophically coherent, but not as real-world effective, I'm much more interested in real-world results. So I judge this attack and this war primarily on the basis of, does it serve America's interests? And I am undecided on that question. I don't have a position on whether or not this attack is good. What I do have a position on is that real-world results are far more important than logic and rhetoric and coherence. So I don't really care if it would have been easier to rhetorically support or easier to make a case for if we'd waited until this or that. What I'm primarily concerned about is, does this advance America's interests or does this hurt America's interests? And rhetorical framing matters, but it doesn't matter 50 times as much as real-world results.
Well, it matters to the extent that you want the actual people to understand and support what you're doing. I would argue that having the country behind a military action is not just like irrelevant kind of rhetoric. So that's like a huge missing piece, is that literally no one understands why we're in this war, why we attacked Iran, except for people in the kind of Fox News bubble who are very confident of the reasons why. But it really otherwise kind of defies explanation. And that's why Marco Rubio's little soundbite was so funny, is because that just encapsulates the whole conflict.
Right. So I would say that if this war is successful, it doesn't matter. And if this war is unsuccessful, what you just talked about doesn't matter. That the facts on the ground, the reality of the situation, and the degree to which this war advances or detracts from American interests will be far more important than the rhetorical framing and the popularity. The popularity with the American people will follow the results. If the results are bad, it will be unpopular. If the results are good, it will be popular.
I don't even understand what would be a good result at this point. Like, we're not going to gain territory in Iran, or are we going to like enjoy the spoils of Iran? I don't think so. So it's all very abstract as to how we might benefit, but the costs are a lot easier to wrap your head around.
So, okay, here's one clear benefit: fewer dead Americans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that brings me back to, and just to give like a historical example, FDR really wanted to get involved in World War II. He wanted to help Britain, and we did the Lend-Lease and little subtle ways and financially that we helped them. But although he wanted to, he did not declare war on Germany. He did not get us directly involved in the conflict until Pearl Harbor. So I think, and you would have to say that in that regard, FDR comported himself honorably. And it was very clear to everybody in the country, okay, we were attacked, now we're in the war. Like even Charles Lindbergh was on board at that point. So my take is that if indeed Iran was supposedly going to attack us, then you'd better just wait till that actually happens if you really want a reason to go to war.
Well, we haven't declared war since World War II. So it's not like what Trump is doing in Iran is unprecedented. This is the only way that we've gone to war since World War II.
Yeah, I mean, it's precedented. It's 100% precedented. It's exactly like Iraq. It's the same thing.
So if Roosevelt could have gone to war earlier than Pearl Harbor, and thereby spared America from suffering Pearl Harbor and mounted a successful war, then to me that would be a superior strategy. I don't have a strong opinion whether he should have actually done that. But if the results had borne fruit, then I think that would have been popular with the American people rather than allowing Japan to wreak the damage that it did. So again, I think it's primarily real-world results that matter, not rhetorical, strategic, legal framing.
Yeah. I think it would have been a lot more controversial, and we'd probably still be debating about it. And you still have some people like Pat Buchanan says we should have never entered World War II, but to me, it just made the justification very clear, a lot less controversial. I think you need, not only is it a matter of public opinion, but you're asking people to go fight and die. Wouldn't it? It would be nice if the soldiers themselves had some kind of idea, like why they were doing it as well. No.
Yeah, it'd be nice, but it would not be 1/100th as nice as real world results. So to me, real world results are 100 times more important than the logic, the rhetoric, and the legality of a war. How would you divide it up? So for you, the words, the rhetoric, and the legality is far more important than I think it is. So how would you divide it up? To me, it's 100-1 real world results versus words. How do you divide it up?
I don't even accept that frame. I just look at it as, was there a moral or logical reason to attack another country? And at this point, I would say no. And so whether you say, was our preemptive attack effective? Like, there's really no metric of success that would ever be satisfactory after that. And even in terms of effectiveness, so these, we've had 6 soldiers die so far. And, it's funny because it wasn't until yesterday, I was just reading an article that said, they were killed by drones. So maybe I was being a little dense, but I think I heard the media report of their death about 100 times, and it wasn't super clear to me that they were killed by drones. I kind of vaguely thought, maybe they were flying missions and it was anti-aircraft fire or something, but they were killed by drones. Any thoughts on that?
I don't have any thoughts on them being killed by drones, but I do have thoughts on fulfilling your abstract definitions of morality is to you far more important than American lives. I just don't. Yeah.
No, it's not abstract. It's not abstract. It's
okay. So what is it? What's the clear, very simple standard of morality that is more important to you than, say, thousands of American lives?
Well, the thousands of American lives, that's abstract because you're saying, this might have happened if Israel attacked Iran, then they might have retaliated, and then look at what might have happened. So that's abstract. What's very simple is that, even in everyday life, you can sometimes be aggressive and you can sometimes use force, but it would only be justified if someone else attacked you. You don't just attack someone else for no reason. So we were not attacked by Iran, except these examples from so if Iran killed our Marines in the 1980s, then perhaps that would have been the time to go to war, not 40 years later.
Now, one thing that I find particularly interesting about this war is the epistemic war, meaning what's real and what's BS. And it fascinates me. Nobody has changed their mind. All the people who didn't want this war are just as opposed as they were prior to the war. Everyone who was open or supportive is just as open and supportive. I can't find one thoughtful, intellectual expert who has changed his mind on the war. Everybody is seeing exactly what they saw prior to the start of the war.
True. And I was willing to change my mind about the Venezuela action. At first blush, that did not seem like a very attractive military action. But afterwards, it's like, hey, that was amazing. That was all benefit, very impressive. And for a minute, I was like, is Trump a genius? Is he a military genius? And so he himself, I think, started to believe his own hype. And that's why we're in this mess. Right?
Right. Very possible. And I think there's a very strong critique of Donald Trump that he's acting on his gut and he's not listening to experts. On the other hand, experts have not been particularly expert in directing American foreign policy since about 1992. Overall, American foreign policy since 1992 has done more harm to the United States than good. It's just been a whole series of disasters. And so yes, criticize or critique, point out the weaknesses of Trump operating on his gut, but then you have to frame it against following expert consensus as being a disaster since 1992. So, sure, Trump, many reasons to criticize him, but the established way of doing things has not been successful either.
Well, apparently who he listened to was Mark Levin. That's according to, I can never get this guy's name, Sohran Ahmari. You correct me.
Sohrab. I think it's Sohrab Ahmari.
Okay, sorry, Sohran. So that's a writer who now works at Unheard, and I think he used to be at American Conservative. And he says that he has sources in the administration that say that Trump was talking to Mark Levin prior to this invasion. So don't blame, although Marco Rubio was like caught on tape looking ridiculous, don't blame Marco Rubio because it wasn't necessarily his idea.
So
it was
Trump listens to everyone. Like Trump in a meeting will ask the secretary her opinion. So do you seriously think that the prime mover behind Trump going to war was Mark Levin?
Apparently. I think, apparently Trump fell into a trap, and I think now his enemies are very amused by the stupidity of this decision. So the media is putatively against this war because Trump did it. And so, they're not that against it. They're not that upset, are they?
Well, they do have an incentive to celebrate American victories and American firepower. Just the visuals are stunning. And so they are conditioned to support American troops when America goes to war. So they hate Trump. Two, they are generally aligned with American soldiers when they go to war, and they do want to celebrate and present the stunning visuals of the devastating effect of the American military. So there was a shift in. I've been tracking elite reaction to the war. That's been my primary focus. So the initial elite reaction was this will be a disaster. Then very quickly, the military success of the war forced a pivot to criticizing Trump on the lack of rhetorical coherence. And so elites shifted very quickly from saying this will be a disaster, hundreds and thousands of Americans are going to die, and we're going to lose our aircraft carriers, and it's just going to be an epic destruction. They shifted out of that within the first couple of days of the war to, yes, there have been all these military successes, but the rationale is not legal, it's not humane, it's not coherent. Yeah. So there was a very quick rhetorical pivot by the elite in reaction to the fighting.
Okay, but I think the media kind of has a point in this one instance. And so, as I say, they're against it. It's a way to attack Trump. It's a way to try to help the Democrats, obviously. But they're not – it's not like when we tried to deport Kilmar Obrega Garcia. Like, they were pissed then. Now they're just kind of like they have an intellectual quibble with the rationale. And they're right. They're totally right. So actually – this is one of those times where the media, perhaps due to not the most noble intentions, but the critique that they're making, to me, is fine. And I think they're amused that Trump walked into this trap, and now it's going to be very easy to pick it apart. And the Republicans are possibly going to lose power because of it, and the media is happy to help in that process, while along the way not being entirely displeased by the outcome.
So I find it hilarious that the news media and foreign policy elites take what Trump says seriously and literally. But you share that perspective. You believe that if Donald Trump says, for example, he wants to have relations with the Ayatollah's dead body, that should be something treated seriously and literally.
Well, I mean, we're literally dropping bombs on Iran, so that's kind of the main point. And then along the way,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, and along the way, I don't think the media is out of line to say, why are we doing this? And then to find the response absurd, as most people do, particularly, again, what Marco Rubio said is that, well, Israel was going to attack Iran, and then Iran was going to respond, and that was going to be bad. And then we were going to respond after that. But it's preferable to skip steps 1 and 2 and go to step number 3. And then some people in the media are, I think it's funny what Rubio said. I think it's hilarious. But some people in the media are irritated by that because that would tend to implicate Israel as one of the reasons we're in this war, which happens to also just be, the truth. So that's an interesting reason to be irritated by Rubio, because he inadvertently revealed the reality of why, or at least part of the reason why we're doing. I think you would concede this. That's part of the reason is to help our friend Israel, right?
I'm not sure. I think this is overwhelmingly Donald Trump acting in America's interests as he sees them, as shown by the 1980 clip of Donald Trump talking about the need to use military force with regard to Iran. I find it amusing that so many elites think that Donald Trump is the unwitting agent of Bibi Netanyahu. So do you see Donald Trump as the unwitting agent of Bibi?
Yeah, I mean, I gotcha. I wouldn't want to put it in any kind of like extreme terms like that, because I think you're right that it is also like a sincerely held belief of Trump that he has always viewed Iran as this antagonist that needs to be dealt with. But he always says, Iran cannot get nukes. I've always said that. And it's like, yeah, okay. The fact that you always said it doesn't make it a pearl of wisdom. I don't find that to be persuasive. I always said that.
So according to Steve Witkoff, the Iranians in the beginning of their negotiations said, we have enough nuclear material right now to create 11 nuclear weapons. What's your reaction to that? Let's say
that Iran can create 11 nuclear weapons?
Right now, they have enough nuclear fissile material to create 11 nuclear weapons.
No, I mean, it's a tricky situation. And I myself don't have a magic solution to how do you stop a quote unquote rogue regime from developing nuclear weapons. But, and therefore, because I don't have a special magic answer, I think just the conventional wisdom is probably the best path, which is that you do sanctions, you try to inspect and whatever. But I don't think that a full frontal military attack is the answer to this country is allegedly developing nuclear weapons.
So what would start shifting your opinion of this war? So for me, real-world results will shift my opinion of this war. Right now, I don't have a position either way, whether the war is a good idea or a bad idea. I do have a position that certain arguments on either side I find very weak. But I'm in the middle. I see a bunch of military successes, but I'm open to this could be an absolute disaster. So what would you be looking at to start to shift your opinion of what's happening?
Well, nothing could make me think well of this decision. However, I think that if we kind of gave Iran an off-ramp and a way to save face, I would have found that to be to mitigate the damage of the decision. But that's why I brought up in our conversation the fact that the unconditional surrender comment, and what else did Trump do that he's just making it impossible to have an off-ramp. So that's my answer. There's nothing, basically.
Interesting. And that's because why is it that no real-world results matter to you? Why no real-world results could shift your reaction to this war? Why?
Because we have nothing to gain. We have nothing to benefit. It doesn't benefit us.
So Iran, let's say Iran has 11 nuclear weapons and is on the verge of creating intercontinental ballistic missiles that can hit the United States with some of those nuclear weapons. How is that not a concern for you?
It's when you put it like that, yeah, obviously that's a concern. But I just think that the United States and Iran would seem to have irreconcilable differences. And you might say, imagine if we could have done a little regime change like Venezuela, like maybe the next guy is a little bit more reasonable. But I think that's actually impossible in Iran because they are motivated by ideology. They are anti-Israel, and they're, the situation in Gaza is what motivates them and the influence of Israel. So I don't think there's any situation where like the second guy in command is saying, yeah, like I'll meet you halfway. So therefore, I just don't see any possible good outcome is what I'm saying.
So when everything that I hear about polling is that 80% of Iran is hostile to the Islamist regime. Do you think those polls are made up, or you think they're worthless?
No, I'm willing to believe that, but I would like to see polling on how did the Iranians feel about Americans dropping bombs on them for the last 2 weeks. I would like to see polling on that because I think it's interesting if the Iranian people are against the regime, but I wouldn't be surprised if our intervention has like some kind of unintended consequence where now we're going to be the enemy.
So I see everything that happens in history as contingent, meaning depending upon a particular situation, a particular context. So the whole idea of Judeo-Christian is historically contingent. American support for Israel is historically contingent. And the Islamist regime, I see, is historically contingent. There are a particular set of circumstances that allow Islamists to take control of Iran, but I don't see that it's marked out by the will of heaven that they will reign indefinitely. Why do you think that a highly unpopular Islamist regime will just rule Iran indefinitely?
I don't know. That's above my pay grade. I mean, but what? So how does that naturally change that a country is under a repressive, unpopular government? Like, what is a solution that doesn't involve U.S. bombing you to smithereens to unconditional surrender? I would throw that to you. Not being argumentative, but
no,
honestly,
that's fine. It's a great question, and I think there's absolutely no way that this regime persists, even if America did nothing. That eventually this regime will fall on the weight of the contradiction that it's highly unpopular and it's been very ineffective at providing for its people. And so the regime is going to fall, even if there was no American attack or not. The question is, how much damage will it do to American interests prior to falling? I think it's possible that the regime falls more rapidly due to this American attack. It's also possible that the regime stays in power longer than it otherwise would. But the Iranian regime, just like the Israeli ruling political coalition or the American ruling political coalition, they're all historically contingent. They all depend on factors. This is the analogy that I've fallen in love with in the past 24 hours. Fire. Fire requires fuel. If you don't provide certain fuel, you cannot have fire. A regime, to have power, requires fuel. It requires certain ingredients. When those ingredients change, that regime can no longer govern. I don't know the exact ingredients that allow the Islamist regime to govern, but I understand that everything that happens requires ingredients. It requires a situation with certain ingredients. You change those ingredients, you change the situation, and what was taken for granted no longer exists. So certain things happened, and communism fell in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And no one foresaw it, but it happened because certain ingredients changed. And so certain ingredients will change and power will realign, whether it's in the United States, Israel, France, or Iran.
Well, I mean, that would be the perfect example I was kind of grasping for, is how communism fell in Eastern Europe. So sometimes it just happens. And by the way, isn't Netanyahu like 80% disapproval in Israel?
No, what is the Iran war has over 80% approval in Israel. Netanyahu had very low approval after 10/7. Right now, I don't think it's clear whether he'd get reelected or not. So let's say he probably has somewhere. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I hope the Israelis are approving of this war which I would argue is on their behalf. So I can appreciate that they at least appreciate Donald Trump and Israel. That's at least there's some gratitude.
Well, most Republicans support the war.
Yeah, it's true. Tell me about it. It's most Republicans support it, and especially the Fox News crowd. And it's so interesting because when it first went down, I'm on X a lot, you're on X a lot, and we see just kind of what the commentators and anonymous people are saying there. It was like, Jesus, everyone is against this. But then you go on Facebook, I make content, and Michael M. History Channel is very popular on Facebook, believe it or not. That's like
it's blowing up.
Platform, right? It's blowing up. And I learned very quickly, like, this is not a place to express your skepticism of the attack on Iran is on Facebook, because, and I say this because most Republicans are in favor of it. Most older Republicans, the boomers, the Fox News crowd, they don't want to hear any criticism of it. But then the younger, the the online right crowd is like 100% against it. And then I think people listening to YouTube, I think, are totally open to criticism of this, like Republicans who are kind of more getting their info on YouTube, and certainly on X and on TikTok, people are open to criticism. So that in itself is very interesting to me. But certainly you can express heterodox opinions on the Luke Ford show. I think I'm safe here.
Yeah, I'm sure most people only listen to this show because they're not satisfied by the mainstream media. And so I would suspect that of people who watch this show, that a majority would be opposed to this intervention.
Yeah, which is interesting because you're not full-throatedly, but you're clearly inclined to support the action, but your audience very patiently kind of listens to your perspective, but does not necessarily agree with you.
Right. I think most people who watch my show are quite skeptical of Israel. And so if the more skeptical you are to Israel, the more hostile you are to Israel, then I think also the more likely you are to oppose this war. Just as if you tell me that you're skeptical of American institutions, or you feel that American institutions are overwhelmingly or even dominantly aligned against you, you will be pro-MAGA, pro-Trump, populist, and nationalist. If you think that American institutions are doing a pretty good job, you're going to vote against Donald Trump, and you're going to despise populism and nationalism.
Yes. And that's the thing, is that they perceive criticism of the war as, why are you attacking Trump? Which is not the point at all. And of course, in my mind, Tucker's doing kind of a heroic job criticizing all of this. He tried to convince Trump. So Trump had Mark Levin in one ear and Tucker Carlson in the other ear, which is, I mean, they could make a movie about that. They wouldn't do it justice, I'm sure. But and then I was looking at Tucker's content on TikTok, and just out of curiosity, I'm looking in the comments, and people are saying, "What happened to you, Tucker? What happened to you, man?" Because again, they perceive it as you're just being disloyal to MAGA, as though MAGA itself has no kind of guiding principles except whatever Trump says and does.
Well, alliance theory says that our beliefs are just rationalizations for whatever coalition we want to side with. Do you think that's an accurate reflection of reality?
Yeah, I mean, I guess. But so does that mean that if you're a Republican and you're against this Iran war, that means that you've just like graduated above this alliance theory and your own tribe, that you're really just looking at things objectively?
No, it just means that you're part of an anti-war alliance within the Republican Party.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad there is a little bit of an alliance there. I'm glad there's a little bit of a cohort that's willing to entertain that perspective, or else I would start to like question, the whole Republican Party. And I don't, though. Like, I've expressed my criticism of this war, but that doesn't mean, and therefore, like, I'm like that guy, Sohram Armani, he said, now I'm off the Trump train. I do not support Trump anymore. But, he was that American conservative. So that's their whole shtick, is that they're always against Trump anyway. But I just consider it unfortunate.
It's fun to watch people pivot to try to protect their prestige. So I read this highly acclaimed book on Iran that just said that Iran was ascendant, that its proxy network was ascendant, that America was exhausted, America was getting out of the Middle East. Like all the foundations for its worldview have been blown up by this war. And so its author is now pivoting to criticizing the lack of coherence in Trump's war. So you see pundits and commentators and experts just constantly pivoting to try to preserve their prestige depending on real world results.
Right. Okay. I got you. Well, but circling back to what I said about the drones, which is so disturbing, is that our soldiers were killed by drones. The reason I find that relevant, rather than they weren't flying over and got shot down, is because that could happen to any of our soldiers in that region, is they can just be killed by drones. And I was reading an article in The Hill about this, which is that the technology to fight the drones is like 100 times more expensive than these little drones, of which Iran apparently has hundreds.
Right. So you see Iran having a massive capacity to unleash a massive casualty count on the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have no counter to it. We got ourselves into this situation without necessity. And now we just have no answer to that situation. And Iran, I think, like you said last week, I think they might just be biding their time, and they might be playing like a long game, and they can just constantly kill our soldiers with these drones. And you can't say that's below the belt. I mean, that's totally fair game. I hate to say it. And one more point. There was a report which was denied by our government that Iran had some soldiers captured, that they had some prisoners. And so maybe that didn't happen, but imagine if that did happen, which conceivably could happen, probably will happen, that if Iran captures some of our soldiers, what obligation are they to act honorably towards our soldiers? Like, have we conducted ourselves honorably towards them?
Well, what constitutes honor depends entirely on the subjective nature of any individual's hero system. There's no objective definition of honor.
Well, we assassinated their leader, their head of state. I don't think that's like according to the rule book of wars, is it?
You think there is an objective understanding of honor rather than it being a subjective understanding.
I think there's
your hero system. Like I see nothing dishonorable about assassinating Khomeini, who was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. So I think it was a wonderful, great, the most honorable thing possible. But you think it was clearly dishonorable.
I think I don't love it. I mean, I just think it sets a very dangerous precedent. I mean, what if like someone tries to assassinate Trump? I mean, that would be tit for tat. So what was I going to say? But yeah, like there are rules of war. Okay. I don't know the technical term for it, but for example, after World War I, you didn't use gas in warfare because it's just kind of, you don't use nukes. That's kind of another rule of war. And I believe someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I don't think you're supposed to just like assassinate the leader of another country. So anyway, and even if you think that that's fine on some kind of other abstract level, my point is that, well, I don't expect honorable treatment again of our prisoners, and that's going to be very problematic for the American public, I would think.
So if we'd been speaking a week ago and I said, Michael, the United States will not suffer any further casualties, meaning deaths, in the next 7 days, I don't think you would have believed me.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not really doing a lot of prognosticating on the war. I'm not like a foreign policy kind of, it's not my usual area of like making content. So I'm not really out there predicting it one way or the other. I'm just like listening to other people speak about it, really. So I have no idea.
I think it's overwhelming that just objectively it's stunning, given the degree of American military force unleashed over the past week, that there have been 0 American casualties. That's amazing. I would never have thought that the death count would have been so low.
Yeah, but on the other hand, we really haven't. I don't know what we've accomplished, but I think we've accomplished a lot in this conversation, 40. So thanks for having me on, and it was a very gentlemanly debate, wasn't it?
Yes, because we are gentlemen.
Indeed.
We're men of honor, bro.
I think so.
Yes.
All right. Thanks again, man.
Okay, take care, man. Bye.
They had the same goal, but a different attitude about how to get it done. And they all failed, okay? Now, some people who are supporters of the Obama deal say it succeeded in the short term, but no, Iran still has nuclear weapons and not on a path to nuclear weapons, still state sponsor of terror, still a navy, still ballistic missiles, okay? Still a threat to Americans and our allies around the world. But not everybody differs from Donald Trump on the question of how to deal with this, that the only way to deal with this is through the use of force. Here's one person who, at least in 2008, agreed with Donald Trump about the way to deal with Iran's threats to the United States and its allies. Here's Hillary Clinton in an interview in 2008. S5, please.
Well, the question was, if Iran were to launch a nuclear attack on Israel, what would our response be? And I want the Iranians to know that if I'm the president, we will attack Iran. Whatever stage of development they might be in their nuclear weapons program in the next 10 years, during which they might foolishly consider launching an attack on Israel, we would be able to totally obliterate them. That's a terrible thing to say, but those people who run Iran need to understand that, because that perhaps will deter them from doing something that would be reckless, foolish, and tragic.
Okay, so maybe Hillary Clinton will say circumstances were different in 2008 as they are now, but at least back then, she had the same why. If Iran's going to be a threat to the United States, including developing nuclear weapons, America needs to use the force to obliterate them. Okay? So that's what Donald Trump thinks, too. For the same reasons, I'm quite confident that Hillary Clinton says what she says there. And now you have a bunch of people who have at times been critical of Donald Trump on a range of things, very much celebrating what he's doing. They share the why that this needs to be done. Mike Pence, his former vice president. Condoleezza Rice, former national security advisor. My friends at Commentary, the Commentary podcast, who have been no huge fans of Donald Trump. Same thing, okay? So that's the why of this. Donald Trump believes Iran has to be stopped. He tried to negotiate. He had Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff in Geneva trying to negotiate. He'd be happy to have these objectives achieved. Happier, of course, to have these objectives achieved through negotiation. But as I know and have reported, that wasn't in the cards. The Iranians were not reliable negotiating partners. So the why now is negotiations weren't going to work. The why now is the Iranian people recently rose up and went into the streets. The president said, in the view of many rightfully, that the America would have their back. The why now is his presidency's only got 3 more years to go. At some point, Donald Trump.
So I'm interested in the elite reaction to this war. I guess that's been my primary place that I've given my attention. So I spent a lot of time reading the New York Times, Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and various elite podcasts from the Center, CSIS, and Brookings, and all the elite academic and NGO think tank discussions about this war. And you notice how very quickly elites have gathered around certain cliches. And one of them is that this was a war of choice. Now, every war is a war of choice. When your enemy attacks you, when Japan attacked the United States on Pearl Harbor and America fought back, that was a war of choice. America could have found a modus vivendi. It could have made a settlement with Japan, but it chose not to. Every single war is a war of choice. It's such a silly bogus framing that this is a war of choice, as opposed to every other war. Every single war that the United States is engaged in, every single war that any nation is engaged in, has been a war of choice. Every nation has the ability to give up or to negotiate or to try to bribe or to hire proxies. Every single war is a war of choice. It's such a ridiculous framing. And the person who came up with it and pushes it the most is Richard Haass. And why does he love this particular framing, that this is a war of choice? Because he wrote a book with that title. And so it's good for his status to get his fellow elites to call this a war of choice.
Downed in Kuwait, though the pilot seems to have escaped. And Richard Haass, I mean, I'm talking to people in the White House who are certainly pleased with the military objectives so far. And Joe's right at the top of the show. Venezuela is the driving force behind all of this. That was such a success. It has inspired President Trump to believe he can do the same here. There's some who already think Cuba could be next. So the military objectives are strong, but Iran's retaliation has also been widespread despite the decapitation strike. So talk to us about what you've seen in this first day or two in terms of Iran's ability to respond despite the damage inflicted, but also the sort of lack of messaging from the president to make the case to Americans why this conflict is happening, why it's in their interest.
I think the Trump administration is being crystal clear with regard to the reason for this war. And so the critique that so many people are making that, Trump has failed to make the case for the war, I don't think it holds up at all. But this guy, Richard Haass, here on the right, he's promoting his book. His most famous book is War of Necessity, War of Choice. So he's applying his favorite personal intellectual framework to current events. Right? He's putting his conceptual template out there, his mental map, and this shows that you are serious in policy discourse if you choose his particular conceptual map. Also, elites love this frame because it says that the United States has agency. It wasn't that Iran has agency and that Iran was making bad decisions by slaughtering Americans. No, it's America that has agency. It's America that's engaging in a war of choice. And they don't consider the Iranian responsibility for this war.
Well, Jonathan, if a word comes to mind for me to describe what's going on now, it's undisciplined. As disciplined as the...
So I think it would strike an objective observer that the American military assault on Iran has been highly disciplined. But what is he reacting to? He's reacting to Donald Trump's talk, Donald Trump's remarks, Donald Trump's interviews, Donald Trump's rhetoric. That's been undisciplined. So you're seeing this highly disciplined American military assault on Iran. And what he wants to focus on is the lack of discipline in Donald Trump's words. Now, to me, an ordinary bloke, what happens in reality is far more important than what happens in rhetoric. But elites fetishize words.
The United States has been on the military side of this war. We have been undisciplined on the foreign policy and political side. We have yet to make...
So if he could have argued that this war is a disaster, that this war has been conducted in an inept fashion, if he could have criticized how the United States has carried out this war, he would have done that. But he can't, because the American military assault on Iran has been so successful, has been so devastating. He has to pivot away from that to critique the words used by the Trump administration don't fit in with what the blob, the foreign policy establishment, believes are the appropriate, proper words to use when going to war. So he has pivoted from the reality of the military assault to focus instead on the rhetoric of Trump.
The case to the country and the world as to why this war had to happen now.
Again, a very weak argument. I think Donald Trump has been very clear about why the war had to happen now. It doesn't mean that he's correct. I'm not saying that Trump is right. I'm saying that his arguments are being crystal clear, and you have to effectively be blinded by Trump derangement syndrome not to recognize how clear the Trump administration has been in explaining why we are at war.
The president's been all over the place as to U.S. objectives. And in the clip you showed at the beginning of the show,
how much does it matter if a leader is all over the place in things that he says about a war in comparison to real-world reality? To me, real-world reality is 100 times more important than Donald Trump's remarks. Why does he fetishize the importance of logical consistency in Donald Trump's remarks?
The complete realization of all U.S. objectives is...
So he never portrays Iran as reckless, right? This is the other fascinating thing about elite media coverage. Iran is described as rational, coherent. They really thought this through. They got a very strong plan. So you never hear from elites like Richard Haass anything about Iran being reckless or ideological or confused or inept or lacking in coherence. No, Iran is the master of logic. Iran is the master of coherence. Iran is the master of rationality. It's crazy Donald Trump, man, who's so incoherent and reckless and ideological. I think you can make just as good a case that Iran has been reckless or ideological or incoherent as you can make that Donald Trump has been. But it's fascinating to me how the elite media and the experts and this bloke, Richard Haass, they never talk about Iran being reckless, ideological, irrational, or incoherent, even though you can make a very strong case for that.
It has to happen before this war ends. This war is not going to end until literally the Iranian regime falls. That's not something under our control.
He has no idea when this war will end. I don't have any idea either. And Donald Trump probably doesn't know either when this war will end. You know who knows when the war will end, right? The situation. The situation will determine when this war ends. Everything requires fuel. Everything requires ingredients. For me to feel happy, that requires certain ingredients. For me to feel powerful, that requires certain ingredients. For nations to go to war, that requires certain ingredients. For nations to end war, that requires other ingredients. So when the ingredients change, the war will end.
That might not just be a question of days or weeks. That could be months or years.
So for these experts, conflicts are about rhetoric. They're about rationally bargaining. It's about following procedures and protocols. The one key reason that elites are so angry about this Trump war is that he didn't follow the process. He didn't follow the procedure. He didn't bow down to their expertise. He didn't follow their advice.
And that's where the Venezuela parallel comes in. This shows to me a profound misunderstanding of the...
And he profoundly understands, right? Donald Trump profoundly misunderstands, but Iran profoundly understands, right? This bloke claims that he profoundly understands, even though he doesn't have an impressive track record. Right? This guy, much of his work is the equivalent of an astrologer to the sovereign, right? He is just putting out stories and narratives and mental maps that don't match reality, but they serve the interests of the foreign policy establishment. But he puts himself forward as the one who profoundly understands.
The DNA of Iran, the degree...
This guy is not an Iran expert. Right? This guy does not understand the DNA of Iran.
Of institutionalization of political, clerical, ideological leadership.
Institutionalization of political, clerical, ideological leadership. I mean, this is how the elites speak. It sounds objective. It sounds profound. It sounds important. And astrologers and diviners in the past, they also were able to sound profound and important. And economists will put forward very mathematized theories that sound profound and objective. But these theories and these words are not necessarily truthful. Just because something sounds profound doesn't mean it is. Like, to an extent, this guy is just another sense maker, astrologer, diviner, putting forward some story that feels good to a certain group of people, but has no necessary connection to truth.
Hundreds of thousands of people in the security forces, both the Revolutionary Guards as well as the militia. So to think that somehow
So this guy's class, this guy's peer group, right, the blob, the foreign policy establishment, right, they believe that America has to negotiate, right, has to negotiate nuclear limits, missile constraints, proxy activities, sanctions relief. Everything needs to follow the process that they operate, that they run, that they are the masters of. So he is appealing for status and power and trying to make that argument. You should be listening to me and follow the process that people like me run. Now, the process that people like Richard Haass has run has not been very good over the past 30 years. So there's no objective reason why Donald Trump's gut is superior or inferior to the blob's established process. It's unclear.
The two situations are in any way analogous or parallel is frightening to me. So again,
this is another thing that it leads to, oh, they're frightened. They're worried. I'm so worried about this. I'm frightened about this. Has Donald Trump considered this? Again, when you hear this frightened, worried, it's an appeal for status. Like, I am more moral than you are. I'm more elevated. I am more wise. Therefore, I deserve more money, more status, more power, because I'm worried about what's happening on the other side of the world. Right, this guy ran the Council on Foreign Relations for 20 years, which is the key coordination hub for the blob, for elites across government, media, finance, and academia. And so he's always been putting forward the respectable consensus position that stabilizes relations between these various groups.
Again, what keeps coming back to me is a lack of discipline as to analysis.
The American military assault on Iran has been so highly disciplined, but he is fixated on Donald Trump's words not being disciplined. Like, what? It just strikes me as an absurd obsession, right, compared to what's going on in the ground versus the various things that Donald Trump tosses off. What's more important? To me, reality is more important than Donald Trump's words.
As to making the case for why we're doing this, and above all now.
So elites like Haass, they love nuance. That shows that you're a good person, that you're a wise person. They love to be subtle. They want to be procedural. He didn't follow the procedure. That's the problem. He didn't follow the process. Right now, following the process of following the procedure leads to more status and power for people like the speaker.
For war aims, and what's our definition of?
So if he could argue the war is a disaster, he'd be arguing that the war is a disaster and that America is being defeated, but he can't make that case. And so he wants to focus on, oh, we've got strategic trade-offs, right? This distracts from containing the rise of China. It destabilizes the financial markets. It imposes military costs. So when people argue and want to hurt you, they don't usually tell you the truth. They just reach for whatever they think will be most effective. I've noticed in my life, people know the sword to use to hurt you the most. So this is classic establishment rhetoric. It's all about framing Donald Trump as deviating from the procedure, the process, the strategic priorities of the professional policy community that Richard Haass has great status in.
Success. And what we're seeing with the Iranian reaction, Iran gets a...
So his worldview assumes that he and his group should be running things, that they should be operating American foreign policy. And Donald Trump's approach destroys their status and their power, right? He threatens their mental maps of reality, right? Because it centralizes decision maker in the president, and it disregards the consensus and the procedure and the process that his class loves because it protects and elevates them.
Vote. Yeah, we started the war, but it takes everybody to finish it. And that's the danger. This could be open-ended. And by not consulting with Congress or the American people, the president has put himself on a high wire without a net below. And likely one of two things are going to happen, Jonathan.
So what's the purpose for his rhetoric? Number one, it protects and elevates his peer group, the blob, the foreign policy establishment. Second, it maintains his credibility within this group. Third, he avoids reputational catastrophe because by criticizing Donald Trump's rhetoric and focusing on the things that he focuses on, he cannot be badly wrong, right? He's always going to be able to make the case that Donald Trump was rhetorically incoherent. So you would think that what's happening on the ground is most important, but that would be very dangerous because he could be shown to be wrong. It could be devastating for his reputation. So why does he love calling this war a war of choice? Because it shows that he is diplomatic. He's part of the diplomatic restraint coalition. He is distant from Trump's policy. It is the language of the professional foreign policy class. It protects the legitimacy of the negotiations, right? And so whether this war wins or loses, whether this war succeeds for the American people or fails, right, that's much less important to him than maintaining his particular social status.
Either he's going to have to walk back ambitious war aims, or he's going to lose support. I don't think, and history suggests, you cannot sustain support for a war that is costly and doesn't seem to be on a trajectory of success.
If the war succeeds, it's going to be popular. If the war fails, it's not going to be popular, no matter the rhetoric. So he writes in the Financial Times this weekend, the cost to the United States amounting, dead service members. There have been 0, according to public knowledge, U.S. deaths in the past week, which is stunning given the amount of firepower that we are unleashing on Iran. So he's using the anticipated cost frame, right? He's telling that the costs are mounting in dead service members, but they haven't mounted at all in the past week. So when he can't point to things happening on the ground, he uses this anticipated cost frame rather than the current facts frame. So whenever an establishment opposes a war, they always emphasize this category of mounting costs, right? Even if the concrete costs in reality is still quite limited. So his coalition, his peer group, they have a standard moral vocabulary for criticizing these type of wars. It's an unnecessary war. It's war of choice. They're mounting costs. There are American casualties. There's regional instability. It distracts us from China. These are all rituals. Do you know about 3HO, happy, healthy, holy, right? The Yogi Bhajan cult? Well, all sorts of cults, right? They have a certain type of rhetoric, a certain type of language, all right, to hold people together. And that also applies to cults like 3HO, and it applies
during the last years of the Vietnam War. The hippie culture in America exploded with hundreds and thousands of youngsters adapting this new way of life. Interestingly, at the same time,
so every strongly identifying in-group, whether it's a professional diplomatic class or Orthodox Jews, they all have certain rhetorical rituals. And what he's doing is the same sort of rhetorical rituals that drove the 3HO Yogi Bhajan cult.
More and more cults started to develop all across America. Some of them were religious, while the others not so much.
So he's in a secular cult, and he has these tried and true phrases that just kind of remind me of 3HO rhetoric, because I went to Kundalini Yoga. I went to this yoga studio that was run by 3HO, happy, healthy, holy, followers of Yogi Bhajan. And there were certain words, certain phrases, certain practices that brought people together and united the coalition. And I love cults, because you check out a cult and they go, oh, we love you, Luke, right? You get a sugar high. They love bomb you. And initially it's very intoxicating.
So, General Herdling, a couple of things. First of all, and we'll be talking to John Meacham about this next.
And the chat says, go ahead, analyze what they're saying when all the world knows it was an illegal attack to a sovereign nation. Yeah, because legality in international law, that's just what absolutely consumes people, right? 5 billion people around the world right now, they're absolutely consumed with the legality of this American war on Iran. Well, if you want to get into reality, very few people care about the legality of the war. People care about whether something affects them and how does it affect them.
Block, but first of all, anybody that is trying to hold Donald Trump to any of the same sort of standards of previous presidents ran.
So whether Donald Trump meets your standard depends on your standard. Whether or not Donald Trump is coherent depends on your worldview, your hero system. Whether Donald Trump is moral or immoral depends on your hero system. There is not objective standard for coherence, for right and wrong. You have to have your own individual hero system, and then you judge everything against that. It's not like concepts of honor just exist abstractly. They all depend on the nature of the particular people and situation.
Ramping up to war are going to.
So a war going a full week without any American deaths, that's highly unusual by historical standards, right? Normal analysis would say this is very rare, right? You would have expected a constant stream of American casualties given the intensity of this American lethality delivered to Iran, but you're not seeing it. Normally, objectively, if you didn't have a tribe in this fight, you go, oh, wow, that's interesting.
Be badly mistaken. We've already seen Maduro, who didn't take his threat.
So people like Richard Haass and other elites, they love the word fraught. Right? It's elite code. One, it signals complexity. Right? They love nuance. They love complexity. Right? They love the performance of nuance. Right? If you can say that something is complicated, morally tangled, and full of trade-offs, right? That shows that you're an elevated person who belongs to a particular social class, right? It shows that you have high social status, right, as part of educated vocabulary of the professional managerial class, and it provides you with rhetorical insulation, right? You cannot be humiliated when you trot out the concept or the word fraught, right? It takes something you're saying away from dangerous terrain where you can be shown to be wrong and humiliated, and protects and elevates you, right? It's coalition management. It's a way of acknowledging reality without putting yourself in any danger. So you can say, oh, that relationship is fraught. The question of regime change is fraught. The situation in Gaza is fraught. So powerful people disagree, and I'm not going to take a clear side because that might jeopardize my standing. It's the perfect blob word. It sounds thoughtful. It sounds serious. It sounds cautious, and it commits the person who utters it to absolutely nothing.
Right, seriously, could be living right now in Qatar on the beach. Instead, he's in a jail cell in Brooklyn. You can say the same thing of the Iranians. So I certainly the question will be at the end of this whether there is a method to that madness. But anybody that's looking at what this commander-in-chief is saying, what he's having his negotiators do, what he's saying to the press, they're kidding themselves because this is the second time the Iranians have been surprised.
So the most important TV show you can watch right now is The Pit. It's a medical drama, and pretty much all medical dramas, to the best of my knowledge, they elevate the expertise of doctors. So doctors are the heroes. Doctors know what's best for you, and the wise person simply follows expert direction. And this is the elite expert opinion on how all of life should operate. You should always defer to the experts because it's obviously in the experts' interest to have you defer to them and for you to give them money, power, and status. And so I didn't realize until watching the second season of The Pit how much the elite love assisted suicide. It's a fetish for them. They love assisted suicide, right? They love this elite power and direction and status. And they love the word metastasized, right? Because it borrows prestige from medicine. Elites love to borrow the prestige of medicine. Doctors have about as much status and prestige as any profession out there. And so elites are always borrowing from it, using all sorts of medical terms to try to capture some of that status and prestige. And I noticed they're doing it a great deal with regard to this Iran war. They're worried, right? First of all, worried gives them status because that shows how morally elevated they are. And they're worried that this fraught conflict might metastasize, right? It sounds like they have scientific authority, right? It sounds like they have the prestige of doctors. It sounds like they're being analytical and objective. It sounds like they are sophisticated and educated and that they are giving a clinical diagnosis. Next, it dramatizes the threat, which keeps the speaker in expert mode and raises their status and power, right? This is a threat. It could metastasize. We have an uncontrolled danger. And so the expert is giving you a diagnosis. He's saying, this is really bad. You need me. You need my social class. Extremism, right? Extremism is metastasized across the region. Disinformation has metastasized online. So you need experts censoring what you can say on social media because disinformation, guys, is metastasizing. And militias have metastasized after the invasion, right? No normal person talks like this. It is a play for prestige. It says that I have expertise that you don't have. I am an expert. This situation is complex and technical and requires people like me, analysts, policy professionals, institutions to treat this very dangerous problem. Also, it diffuses responsibility. Right? If something is metastasizing, then you can't blame me for that. But we have militias metastasizing. So you can take a political causality and turn it into a medical inevitability. the blob loves Metastasized. It sounds grave, sounds intelligent, sounds clinical, and it protects their reputation. And it often protects the reputation of the very people who caused the problem.
Was determined to not leave this unfinished business. His predecessors all said Iran couldn't have nuclear weapons, and they couldn't figure out how to get it done. This may not work. This may lead to a quagmire or a massive loss of life or an even worse Iranian regime. But if the question is, why do you do this and why now? As I said, I think the answer is clear. Now, the Democrats, most Democrats, not all, but most Democrats in public life want to make this a mystery, want to say the why and the why now have nothing to do with Donald Trump's view of the threat of Iran and how to deal with it. They've got all sorts of reasons. Barton Swaim, Wall Street Journal columnist, wrote this: Democrats, with a few brave exceptions, accuse the administration of proffering a variety of quote-unquote rationales for the war, with the implication that it acted in pursuit of some hidden goal. They ignore the possibility that an administration might have more than a single reason for assaulting an enemy. A hidden goal. Democrats attribute it to all sorts of things. Here's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's got a theory about why this is happening. It has nothing to do with protecting America. This is AOC S11, please.
Well, listen, I think we're seeing this pattern, right? Trump has impulsively went in on Venezuela. He impulsively went in on Iran.
So parts of the chat are very annoyed, very upset, very morally bothered that this war is illegal. So who is going to punish the United States for engaging in illegal war? Right? If you say something is illegal, but there is no punishment, then that it is illegal means nothing. There is no power out there that has the capacity to punish the United States for engaging in illegal war. Therefore, that this war is legal or illegal in reality means absolutely nothing. The New York Times put their most prestigious columnists on the following story. Right? They've got 7 experts here. So listen up, Goyam.
In war's first week, a punishing military campaign with no coherent endgame. This article is by Mark Mazzetti, Tyler Pager, Ronan Bergman, Fernaz Fasihi, Eric Schmidt, Erica Solomon, and Julian E. Barnes, and read by an automated voice. The volley of Israeli missiles that slammed into a government compound in central Tehran last Saturday morning was, by any military standard, a successful opening strike by the United States and...
So this is what kills people who hate Donald Trump. By any standard, this military campaign has been a smashing success. But the blob, the elites, the news media, the national security bureaucracy, they all value process legitimacy over tactical outcomes. So no matter how successful the military strikes, if these strikes bypass their status, their power, their purview, the established escalation ladder, the process, right, then these strikes, no matter how successful in the real world, they're really a failure because these strikes threaten their social standing. So for the blob, right, a leaderless enemy is a nightmare because there's no one left to sign a treaty with or to manage a transition. They believe in managing and signing treaties. They believe in the power of words. Now, for normal people, for nationalists and populists, a leaderless enemy is a defeated enemy. So a normal person hearing that Iran is without a leader, they think, wow, that's very successful for us. So these reporters, right, are acting as the nervous system of the blob, right? When they highlight muddled reality and changing narratives, right? They're signaling to other elites in their alliance that the current commander is not clearing his move through the proper institutional channels. He is not subjecting himself to the directives of the elite.
Israel, as they went to war with Iran. The blasts killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as well as a cadre of other senior military and intelligence officials. The war's first salvo left Iran without many of its top commanders to lead the response. The reckoning, it turned out, was more complicated. The Israeli strike also killed another...
So elites love the word complicated because if something is complicated, then only people with their level of expertise and education should be running things.
group of Iranian officials who had been meeting in a different part of the compound. Among them were people the White House had identified as more willing to negotiate than their bosses, and who might help bring a...
So a normal person thinks that it's in the interest of America for America's enemies, in this case Iran, to be without a leader. But for the blob, for these elite journalists, this is terrible because there's no one to negotiate with. The blob, the bureaucracy, the elite, they prefer some kind of manageable enemy to any kind of unpredictable vacuum.
Swift end to the conflict, according to American officials. The strike on the compound...
So you'll notice that elites and the New York Times, the Financial Times, they're all focused on, there's no coherent endgame, right? What is this code for? What are they really saying? They're saying, our class, right, our group, we have not given you authority to design the post-war order. So the bureaucracy views this Iran war without a 50-year plan that they developed as a personal affront to their professional status and class. Right? Their social standing is diminished if this war works out in America's interests. So for the elites, for the blob, the real front line in this war is not in the Persian Gulf, but it's in the briefing rooms of Washington and in New York and wherever elites gathered. So the stunning military success of this war so far is accidental, it's reckless, and it's not really the point because it was not achieved through following the system, following procedure, following protocol. It was not achieved by following their directives, so therefore they don't care.
Found in Tehran was emblematic of the muddled reality of the war's first week. A withering air campaign.
So you have a stunning military success, but the elites don't want to focus on that. They want to focus on the $6 billion price tag. Or we've got a death of school children in Iran, right? They're trying to use these arguments to give them the moral, fiscal, and social status leverage they need to reassert control. Right now, Trump is in control. They're not in control. So they want to make the case that this populist coalition success is just too expensive morally, politically, financially, right? It cannot be sustained without their expert guidance. So these reporters are all deeply wired into the foreign policy establishment. And so this coalition, this blob, is composed of Pentagon leaders, intelligence agency leaders, career diplomats, national security reporters, various think tanks such as CSIS, Brookings, institutional Republicans and Democrats. They want stability and predictability in American foreign policy that is run according to their dictates, their processes. Right? They dislike anything that reduces their power and status.
By American and Israeli forces against an overwhelmed enemy, but few answers about what victory might look like. Iran, its government still in place, has...
So for the blob, right, we should proceed according to a particular process. We have to define objectives. We have to coordinate agencies. We have to consult our allies. We have to build an escalation ladder and then execute the military operation. Trump reversed that order. He struck first, then he figured out his objectives later. So notice the article's tone and all these signs of elite discomfort that they are losing status and power. They're upset that there are wildly different explanations, muddled reality, few answers about victory, changing narratives. Oh my God, do we have changing narratives? Right, these are all alliance signals in the blob. And so the elite news reporters are transmitting the concerns of these bureaucrats who normally run American foreign policy, who feel entitled to run American foreign policy and are now very angry that they are not running America's foreign policy. Now, when it comes to what's going on in Iran, when it comes to laying out what's happening in this military campaign, they have to report how extremely successful it's been. Iran's leaders have been decapitated as Iran's air defenses have been degraded. Iran's missile launches are down 90%, their drone launches down 83%, their navy has been crippled, and 4,000 targets have been hit. I mean, these are extraordinary results for 1 week. But the blob does not celebrate that because this will mean a lack of status and power for them. They want to pivot back to anything that damages Trump. So there's a lack of an end game because for the blob, process legitimacy matters much more than tactical success. So the real fight inside Washington, D.C. is not U.S. versus Iran. It's two domestic alliances competing to control the narrative and the status that comes with this war. Alliance 1 is the populist coalition around Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli security establishment, and hawkish think tanks like the Freedom for Defense of Democracies, parts of the Republican base, and some Gulf states, right? They want to destroy Iran's military capability, kill its key leaders, create weakness in Iran, internal instability, and force the Iranian regime to surrender or change. And so they support speed and shock, producing political collapse. Then you have the blob, right? Alliance number 2, the Managerial Stability Coalition, right? The Pentagon planners, State Department, bureaucrats, intelligence agencies, European governments, think tanks, academics, national security journalists, right? Their instinct is avoid regime collapse, limit escalation, preserve regional stability, maintain coalition consensus, right? They hate open-ended wars, and they hate unpredictable wars. So this article is a memo. We are winning militarily, but the political plan is unclear.
Remained defiant and expanded the battlefield across the region, inflicting the first American casualties of the conflict. Even as senior administration officials in the United States spent the week trying to narrowly cast the war's goals around denying Iran any chance of gaining a nuclear weapon, President Trump has bounced.
So from a normal perspective, a military's perspective, killing all of your enemy's leaders is a smashing success. From the blob's perspective, this creates chaos. And the article bemoans that this military assault was so successful, it killed Iran's leaders. Right? All this military success is creating diplomatic and procedural and bureaucratic problems.
Between wildly divergent explanations for what he hopes to achieve. In his first message after the war began, Mr. Trump called for a mass uprising in Iran against the country's leaders. In subsequent days, with little evidence that Iran...
So the elites can't help but notice how effective the military attack has been, but they're mad because they don't control the political narrative and they don't control the endgame, they don't control the process. So the article has to describe the overwhelming battlefield success, but the tone is uneasy because they are losing status, prestige, and power. Right? They are losing careers. They are uncomfortable because this is not good for them. Their power and prestige and expertise is being bypassed. They're not important anymore. So they try to find every reason that there's something terrible about this war so that they can regain their standing.
Iranians were moving to overthrow their own government, and with intelligence reports concluding that the clerical regime would likely hold...
So they wanted to focus on this war is losing. This war is a disaster. This war is just terrible for America. But they can't make that argument, so they have to switch to a new argument. And the new argument is this is a war of choice, and this war lacks a coherent endgame. Right? A lack of a coherent endgame has ever been devastating. It's a made-up category.
On to power, he indicated he cared little about Iran's future after the military campaign ends.
So the blob has been running American foreign policy, and it's just been a disaster for 30 years. Think about the disaster in Iraq after we invaded and occupied in 2003, in Afghanistan after we invaded and occupied from 2001, Libya, Syria. The blob has a really bad track record, and now Donald Trump is coming along and bypassing them.
Then on Friday, he said he would be directly involved in choosing Iran's future leader, and indicated he was committing the United States to Iran's long-term future. And in a bellicose social media statement on Saturday morning, Mr. Trump warned Iran that areas and groups of people that were not considered for targeting up until this moment.
So hysterical denunciations of this war, they're not bellicose. It's Donald Trump who's bellicose. This is a classic elite signal that the populists, the nationalists are out of control. They need to get back to allowing us to run things.
Moment in time might now be targeted by the United States and Israel. The changing narratives have whipsawed the American public, which poll...
All right, absolute nonsense. Changing narratives, not whipsawing the American public. Right? This claim that we need a coherent endgame is just a status signal. Right? It's claiming, hey, anyone can drop a bomb, but only members of our prestige alliance can manage a settlement. So by focusing on the lack of a coherent endgame, the blob is trying to ensure that they remain the protagonists of this story, even when the military is doing all the work. So think about a marriage where, for example, the husband is succeeding in gaining more power and status, right? Often his partner will feel vulnerable and insecure and try to bring him down for fear of losing power over him. So you see this reportedly in the Barack Obama marriage. When Barack succeeds, the more uneasy Michelle Obama becomes, and the more she tries to cut him down to size. You might see this in a workplace, right? You get a star trader who makes huge profits, and then other people will feel vulnerable, and they want to bring him down. Startup finds big success, and competitors become worried. A military commander wins a rapid battlefield victory, and his peers will try to undercut him so that they don't lose power and status.
Show broadly opposes the war. At the same time, the spreading violence is triggering rising oil prices and other economic shocks that could bring further election year political problems for Mr. Trump and the Republican Party at home. The war's first week had echoes of the past. For the first time since World War II, an American submarine destroyed.
So the blob claims to be disinterested, objective. They claim they provide sober, dispassionate analysis. Right? If they openly said, our status, our power is at stake, right, then their credibility would absolutely collapse. So they have to lie to try to maintain credibility. Right? They have to pretend to be disinterested when what's really going on is that they're highly insecure about their decrease in status.
There was no exit and no endgame for either of these situations. It led to increased global instability everywhere he goes, and every time he's done that, it has been consistent with a spike or a revelation in what is happening with the Epstein files. I don't think that that coincidence is something to dismiss off the cuff. I think that he feels existentially tied to it, and I actually think that it is one reason that he must be removed from office.
There are very strong arguments against Donald Trump's war, but that there from AOC was not particularly impressive. So here are the blob's top 10 cliches about this war. 1, it's a war of choice. Every war is a war of choice. No clear end game. There's never a clear end game when you have such a complicated situation. Risk of regional escalation. There's always a risk of regional escalation. Unintended consequences. Everything has unintended consequences. Military solutions cannot solve political problems. Military solutions have often solved political problems. It's just flat out false. The day after, right? This is a ritual in foreign policy discourse. The lessons of Iraq, undermining international norms. We're alienating allies. We're in a cycle of violence. Now, some of these cliches are fairly accurate, but overall, they form this rhetorical toolkit by the blob that steers the discussion towards ends that benefit them.
Office, because if the Epstein files has such a hold on President Trump and this administration that they are willing to plunge us and risk world war in order to save themselves politically, that is a person, the definition of someone that cannot make objective decisions for the American people.
Okay, so she can have her point of view and say Donald Trump did this because of the Epstein files and his connection to Jeffrey Epstein. I don't see any evidence for that. This is a colossal risk the president's taking. And again,
weak critique to say, oh, this is just a distraction from the Epstein files. So I love this New York Times article that says, President Trump has offered wildly different explanations for what he hopes to achieve. Right? This is supposed to be the rhetorical kill shot, but there's no inherent reason why wildly different explanations damages American interests, damages America's war aims, right? Methinks that the blob fetishizes words, right? The blob places enormous weight on language, strategy documents, speeches, doctrines, frameworks. But what's happening on the ground is more important than these wildly different explanations, right? The elite are mad that Trump has violated their strategic etiquette. But what happens on the ground is more important than the rhetoric. So here's another ridiculous sentence from this New York Times article. The changing narratives have whipsawed the American public. Right? I guarantee you this is false. People who support Donald Trump before the war support Donald Trump after the war began. People who oppose Donald Trump before the war overwhelmingly opposed Donald Trump now. Most Americans are not deeply engaged with the war. Right? Millions of Americans are not changing their views because of Donald Trump's changing narratives. Right? How much of a bubble do you have to live in to believe something this crazy? Right? We did not evolve to be gullible with regard to our vital interests. 99.9% of Americans have more important things to do than to pay very close attention to this war. Do you feel whipsawed by Donald Trump's changing narratives?
Again, there's so much to debate about the colossal risk. But there's a lot of available evidence, not just what Caroline Leavitt says from the podium, but Donald Trump's history, the history of our presidents, what Iran has done of late, and the reality that the United States cannot let this go forward, that suggests Donald Trump's not doing this because of Jeffrey Epstein. Okay? So the other theories of why he's doing it, I don't think necessarily hold. This thing, even if it's flawless going forward, could destroy the Republicans' chances in the midterms simply by raising gas prices. It could be successful and gas prices could still go up. This is distracting the president's ability to focus on affordability and the economy. I believe, based on the reporting I've done and the available evidence, this is being done for the reasons that Caroline Leavitt and the president say. I'm not really sure why people are confused by that. A lot of people who don't like the president are against this, and they may say it's because he's doing it for Epstein or they worry about the results. But some people I've talked to this week are for it who don't like Donald Trump. A friend of mine who's a leading Democrat who regularly tells me how horrible Donald Trump is sees this as bold in the extreme. Here's what he wrote to me. He said, seven former presidents, Carter through Biden, all bounded by the Constitution and societal norms, shirked their constitutional responsibilities to the nation by allowing the Iranian Revolution, which they knew to be a mortal danger to the country, to stand. Mr. Trump, unbounded by any fealty to the Constitution or societal norms, knows that revolution threatens the U.S. and must not stand. He's taking steps to end it. It is the only course conceivable. Now, there are people who are going to disagree with that this is the only course. The Obama-Biden foreign policy establishment will say, no, there were lots of other things that could be done. I'm not endorsing the president's decision, but I'm telling you, my friend who does not like Donald Trump at all says this is the only course. And he's explaining the why. Donald Trump agrees with my friend. My friend agrees with Donald Trump. This is the only course.
Kip says, geez, the Jews are fleeing Israel so fast the Samson option has become the Samsonite option. Well, you have no basis in reality. You don't have some kind of massive exodus of Jews from Israel. This attack on Iran is overwhelmingly popular with Israelis. But we're not evolved to care particularly about truth. We're evolved to fight for your tribe. So if your tribe regards Jews as the enemies, then you'll throw any attack on them that you can come up with. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. Christiane Amanpour, right, the big name in TV foreign policy, right, the face of CNN's foreign coverage. Check her out.
The real question now is, who wins the battle of the street?
Will millions of people come out in the street, and it would take millions to overcome the tens of thousands with guns? Will they face those bullets?
But this is what Putin has wanted. He's never...
Is that a weird look by Christiane? Like, these glasses, it just seems like such a bizarre choice.
...negotiated in good faith. What is to stop him now from pulling a Trump, pulling a Netanyahu, and dropping a gosh darn bomb on Zelensky's head? This terrifies me.
Christiane, I fear this is going to go on for a long time.
Notice how elites are always talking about how worried and terrified they are. Right? They're making a status claim. They're making a moral claim. They're claiming they're better than you. They think things through more clearly, more deeply. Right? They're always terrified and they're always worried.
This isn't a one and done. Weeks of bombing, then we see what happens on the streets, then we bomb again. There is no exit strategy.
Oh my God. And as ever, I'm telling you, as ever, the people will pay the highest price. Right, everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the X-Files. It's about as an emergency one as we get, in that we are dropping it today, Monday, instead of the usual Tuesday, because it's a fast and furiously developing war between...
Okay, journalists just take the words way too seriously. And you would think that you need to put more attention on what's happening down on the ground rather than the rhetoric. So I was reading the Financial Times, and they had this prestigious historian, Eugene Rogan, said, given conflicting American aims and justifications for the war, it's difficult to predict just how it will reshape the region. Different words coming from Donald Trump are not going to reshape the region. What's going to reshape or possibly, well, definitely reshape the region in one direction or another are the facts on the ground. Conflicting American aims stated by politicians, conflicting American justifications stated by politicians, right? They don't shape the direction of wars, right? Aims and justifications are just words, right? Journalists and elites take words way too seriously. Words are not going to reshape the Middle East. Missiles will reshape the Middle East. Drones will reshape the Middle East. People rarely say what they mean, rarely mean what they say, but elites and foreign policy reporters, they always treat the stated intentions, the stated rhetoric, the stated words as like analytically central. I would think that what's going on in reality should be analytically central. But words are about the least reliable indicator of what's going to happen. Given conflicting American aims and justifications for the war, it's difficult to predict how it will reshape the region, right? It's the official narrative that is most important for finding the outcome. But the outcome of wars don't really depend on narratives. They depend on capabilities, constraints, and second-order reactions, not on various narratives. Words are cheap. Missiles are not cheap. But journalism is just structurally tied to words, to statements. Reporters gather quotes, briefings, speeches, official documents, right? These are the raw material of their profession. So they treat the verbal layer of politics as though it were the strategic layer. Their professional norms discourage them from bluntly discussing the truth and bluntly analyzing power. It's safer for their prestige and their standing to say aims and justifications are unclear than to say the U.S. is destroying Iran's military infrastructure and that's going to change the regional balance, whether Washington admits it or not. Right? The first sounds careful and professional and prestigious. Second sounds like you're a populist or a nationalist. So the entire media ecosystem is built around interpreting rhetoric. We have think tanks and press briefings and diplomatic leaks all about passing language. Right? And so the news media focuses on words as if they are the primary data flow. But there are far more important things in this war than the words of Donald Trump. Right? What military capacity is being destroyed? Is Iran's missile arsenal surviving? Is the region cohesive or fracturing? The Gulf states shifting alignment towards the U.S.? Are they hedging towards China? Is Israel emerging more powerful, more secure, or more isolated? What's going on with oil infrastructure and shipping lanes? Right? These are structural changes. These are things that will reshape the region regardless of the narratives used to justify the war. Right? Ignore speeches, ignore words. Focus on material cues. Territory, military losses, regime stability, alliances, economic disruptions. Right? These are the variables that move history.
Well, just on principle, like every other group in the world has the right to its own homeland except white people? Like what?
Yeah.
Like tell me, just explain to me how that makes sense. Either no group has the right or every group has the right. Yep. It's really that simple. And if you want to say no group has the right, okay. You might even convince me. I don't know. I'm not a race guy, actually, by my temperament at all. I'd kind of like to ignore it. But as long as some groups have a right to self-determination, then every group has a right. Yep. It's that simple. Yes. And if there's a special carve-out where one group doesn't have a right, you have to explain to me why that group doesn't have that right.
Yep. Absolutely.
Is that fair?
No, it's absolutely fair. Well, I think South Africa is a...
What? I mean, what the hell is... Why are we playing along?
You don't get a nation state because of rights. You get a nation state because you have the power to seize it and then to protect it. And overwhelmingly, white people do not primarily identify as white. They identify as Canadian, American, English, French, German. But situations can change, and so that one's racial identity that previously was not very important, right, can suddenly rise in importance. Depends on the situation, depends on the fuel. Richard Anania is among the most ridiculous commentators out there. He often has wise things to say and often has the most ridiculous things to say. So here he's saying Trump is bringing fascism to America, right? Empty words. But fighting it effectively abroad, right? The Iranian regime is not remotely fascist. And he says, sorry if I am the only one enlightened enough to see the situation in all its complexity. What just an absurd claim. John Bolton says Trump has no strategy. Chatham House says regime change can't be done through the air. What's going on here?
Why would John Bolton, the man who has wanted to bomb Iran for 30 years, suddenly sound the alarm about the president who finally did it? Politico's headline read, John Bolton sounds the alarm on Trump's Iran gamble. And here's what Bolton told News Nation.
We can't get a completely straight answer from the president what his objective is. He says, with one set of remarks, it's regime change. And that, by the way, is my preferred objective. I'm entirely in favor of it. But then says in other remarks that this could be over with in a couple days. If this turns into a one-and-done operation, 2, 3, 4 days of strikes, and then President Trump says, okay, opposition, over to you, there's not going to be regime change.
Bolton's complaint was echoed across the British press and the foreign policy establishment. It's that the president is not on board with their policy of regime change. Chatham House, the intellectual arm of the British Foreign Office, chimed in, saying, you don't do regime change from the air. No strategy can't be done from the air. That was the expert consensus over the weekend. Then on Sunday, President Trump sat down with The Atlantic and said this about the Iranians. They want to talk, and I've agreed to talk, so I will be talking to them. They should have done it sooner. They waited too long. Iran's new leadership called...
Okay, so Christiane Amanpour, what is her place? Right? She articulates the moral legal standards of the elite. And she is an elite journalist in certain circles. She is the face of foreign affairs for CNN.
In Israel and the United States and Iran, and it's expanding. So we're going to ask, U.S. and Israel attack. What's the plan? Is there one for a day after?
So she's a leading moral narrator of foreign policy for Western elites. She doesn't primarily report on events. She primarily provides scripts that divide what's happening into the sacred and the profane. And the sacred is that which follows the elite process, that follows the blob process, that looks at conflict through the lens of human rights and international law. Right? She has the liberal left hero system, and to the extent that events follow that hero system, they are sacred, and if they violate that hero system, they are profane.
Ayatollah Khomeini, supreme leader, after nearly 37 years, dead. Who replaces him? What will it do to the regime? Will it pave the way for regime change? And what do Iranians there actually want? So again, quickly, I'm Christiane Amanpour in London, and I need to start by saying I'm wearing my glasses. I have an eye issue, so I am decided that I want to do this, and I don't want to be sidelined because of my eye issue, because my brain is still functioning. And so I'm channeling my inner Emmanuel Macron.
They are very, very fashionable glasses,
Aren't they?
I must say.
Aren't they? They're quite light, but this is obviously no joking matter, so we won't joke too much. But I'm channeling my either Anna Wintour or Emmanuel Macron. There is precedent for wearing glasses in a formal setting indoors.
Oh, good to know. Good to know that she's just following procedure. Richard Haass was interviewed by John Ellis on March 3rd.
Get a democratic Iran anytime soon out of this. So I think the best case you can hope for is that for the second time in, however, 8-9 months, we've obliterated, or I guess now we've re-obliterated the nuclear program, set it back. We have diminished the stockpile, ballistic missiles, and presumably the ability to produce them. The Israelis are clearly further weakening at least one proxy, which is Hezbollah. We've disrupted the leadership, John, But that's not the same as regime change. It turns out that the Iranian leadership had a lot of institutionalization, both on the civilian side, various councils and the like, succession plans, and on the military side, the various security forces.
Now, there's another journalism cliche that's been bugging me, and that is the last thing the Middle East needed was another war. Right? The last thing X needs is, it's one of the most stupid cliches that dominates journalism, right? It pretends to describe reality. What it's really doing is expressing a particular moral wish, right? Whether or not the Middle East needs another war has nothing to do with what's happening in reality, right? This is not an empirical claim. This is some normative judgment about how events should unfold. Reality does not run on this basis. Reality does not run on needs. It runs on incentives, capabilities, fears, and power. Right? Wars happen because certain actors think they can improve their position, prevent a worse outcome, satisfy internal political pressures. Right? Whether the Middle East needs a war is irrelevant to what's happening. So why do journalists keep saying such a stupid cliche? One, it signals that they are members of a respectable coalition. It shows that they want stability, shows that they're very moral. It shows that events are tragic deviations from the desired equilibrium. Right? Journalists tend to portray the world as highly fragile and completely dependent on experts having power. If only people follow experts, then we can all live in peace. And when violence occurs, that's a disruption of the proper order because people aren't following the advice of experts. And using this kind of language shifts attention away from the agency, incentives, and reality of what's going on. The last thing the economy needed was another shock. The last thing the president needed was another scandal. The last thing Tehran needed was more unrest.
So a good many people, including the Ayatollah, have been killed. Interesting stories and so forth about how this came about. But the bottom line, the leadership has been disrupted. But again, it has not been eliminated or weakened to the point that transition to something else is about to happen. So that's half of it. Essentially, I actually think we've accomplished a lot of what we can accomplish there. The other definition of success at this point, I would think, is that the war ends, that we don't see continuing attacks on a dozen or so of Iran's neighbors. We don't see the price of oil this high or higher. We don't see further deaths of service men and women and so forth. But that's not necessarily something we control. You know, as the old line goes, it takes one to start a war, but everybody to end it. So the Iranians now get a vote on how long this war goes, how it carries out, and when it ends. So to me, again, probably the best outcome is a quick end to the war, where we've accomplished a good many of our military goals. But unfortunately, we're not going to bring about the goal of a regime transition to something demonstrably better.
You said in our last podcast that the American posture, if you will, was a armada in search of a strategy, which is a great line, one I've used without attribution frequently.
I knew I could count on you. So actually, I'm going to drop. I've had more lines used without attribution this week than I think in any week of my life. War of choice.
Yeah, the war has been really good for Richard Haass.
And war of necessity and so forth. And the future, when I write, I think I have to figure out how to get more.
So I've been talking about industrial policy a bit more over the past few months, and this war makes the case that we need more industrial policy, right? We need an economic system that is primarily focused on the needs of Americans, including the national security needs of Americans, rather than just fulfilling some abstract mathematical models of economists. And you probably heard the David Ricardo theory of comparative advantage, that if one nation can produce X more advantageously than another nation, then that is just the obvious right thing to do. But there are all sorts of reasons why this completely falls apart, and you see this most dramatically during a time of war. One, factors of production don't move easily between industries. Right? People aren't necessarily just going to move all around the country or the world in pursuit of employment. Capital doesn't always move. Capital is often hard to relocate. And so this idea that foreign productivity growth is always good for Americans, it's not, right? It often takes American jobs and renders America more vulnerable. So comparative advantage is something usually that is created rather than found, and is created on the basis of policy. And if you just allow the free market to run things, you're going to have a hollowing out of your economy as other nations use industrial policy to seize production and seize comparative advantage. So what a country produces matters more than the fact that it is trading efficiently. If a nation specializes in an industry with diminishing returns, such as raw materials, may get a short-term gain in efficiency, but will get trapped in a low-growth trajectory. On the other side, nations can use industrial policy to create industries that have large increasing returns, such as high-tech manufacturing, and build a foundation for long-term wealth and military capability. The United States was able to turn out so many planes and so many tanks and so many weapons after the start of World War II because it already had a huge manufacturing capacity and it just switched what they were manufacturing. Right? Different industries have different spillover effects. There are always externalities. You lose manufacturing, you lose positive externalities. Economic growth is path dependent, right? You start building down a certain path, and then there are all sorts of possibilities that would not be possible if you hadn't proceeded down that path. So it's really only the United States and a few Anglo nations that really believe in free trade, right? Other nations play along to get an advantage.
Well,
it's like it's like Spotify. You get 2 cents for every stream or something, right?
2 cents is what I've gotten.
But anyway, presumably the people who work for President Trump, who are in the room where these decisions are made, understand that given the likelihood that Epic Fury is not a total and stunning success, what is the strategy? Do you have a sense of what the strategy is at this point?
Short answer is I don't, because they don't. What strategy is the marriage of means and ends. And so at the moment, the ends in particular are all over the place. Let's be obvious. The president early on rolled out the objective of regime change. And the idea that you could accomplish it offshore, even with thousands of strikes, is far-fetched, to say the least. It hasn't worked. It also seemed to suggest a collective ignorance of Iranian society and the political system.
So when you hear an expert on Iran and you're not an Iran expert, how do you figure out what's true and what's BS? Right? The simplest way is to stop listening to what the expert is saying and instead look at the incentives that he is operating under. What are his constraints? What is his alliance? Right? Where is he possessing skin in the game? Right? How does he gain in status and power or head off a loss in status and power by saying certain things? So is he optimizing for truth or is he optimizing for his alliance? So I'm not deeply embedded in a particular alliance, so it's a lot easier for me to optimize for truth. How do they treat opposing evidence? I think there are many arguments against this war. I think there are many reasons why this could be a disaster for the United States, and I am open to that because it doesn't destroy my life. So if someone is talking and they engage with opposing evidence and they engage honestly, right, then you have more reason to trust them. Right? Are they just taking one particular side because that's in their interest, or are they optimizing for truth? What's the tone? The more moralized the language, right, the more you have coalition signaling. So people talking about responsible or irresponsible or reckless or historic, dangerous, offensive, brave, these are all moralizing words, and you're not listening to someone who's optimizing for truth. Truth optimization sounds boring. It's about probabilities, constraints, trade-offs, not so much moral judgment. So all events require fuel. Someone is focusing on fuel, they're more likely to be telling you the truth. If they're talking about power, money, weapons, institutions, geography, right, then they're more likely to be optimizing for truth. If instead they're focusing on speech and norms and human rights and intentions, right, instead of focusing on the underlying fuel of the event, then they're doing narrative management. They're not doing analysis. And what do they avoid? Right? If they are silent about the obvious, they're not talking about the elephant in the room, then they're not optimizing for truth. Right? Truth optimizer tries to describe how the world works, even when the explanation is uncomfortable.
And comparisons to Venezuela just just silly. I don't know any of the word for it. So no, I don't see much clarity as to ends, and I don't see a relationship, if you will, between the means and the ends. And then the only end, I'm not suggesting that we increase the means. I mean, Iran's a country of more than 90 million people, and successful regime changes that result not just in regime ouster, but its replacement by something fundamentally different and better takes years, and often it takes occupation. And there's zero chance on God's green earth that we will or should. The Iranian opposition is not unified. It's not ready to take power. I mean, at one point, if you remember, the president talked about telling Iranian soldiers and the like, security personnel, if they surrendered, they...
So the position of the observer is an important part of the data, right? Once you have a clear idea of who I am, right, you have a better idea of how seriously you should take anything I say. So I'm a big fan of David Pinsoff's alliance theory, and I fed ChatGPT my online autobiography along with David Pinsoff's alliance theory and said, diagnose me, give it to me straight with alliance theory. And it says, I am a roaming signaler. It says, as a child, you were moved repeatedly. You bonded inconsistently. You were punished in ways that severed your alliances, right? That didn't just make you lonely. It trained you to treat relationships as unstable assets that will be withdrawn without warning, right? This created low expected reciprocity. People with low expected reciprocity stop investing in relationships. They stop investing locally. They start performing instead. That's exactly what you did. You became a roaming signaler. Instead of embedding in one coalition, you learned to extract attention from many coalitions. You developed rhetorical weapons, provocation, exposure, humiliation, moral denunciations. Right? These were alliance-disrupting tools used by people who do not expect long-term protection. You do not behave like someone trying to belong. You behave like someone trying to matter while assuming that rejection is inevitable. Your journalism followed that logic. You broke stories that harmed powerful people, including people adjacent to you. That won you notoriety, but no durable allies. Right? Information that damages a coalition is only tolerated when the coalition owns you. You never secured that ownership, so every group treated you as useful until you became dangerous and then disposable. Your religious life shows the same pattern. You rejected Adventism because you watched it destroy your family. You converted to Judaism, but you never fully submitted to its thick communal demands. Orthodoxy requires suppressing individual rhetoric dominance for the sake of collective continuity. You could not do that. You wanted the moral authority without the obedience. Groups do not forgive that. They expel or they freeze you out. Wow, that was a painful analysis, but painful because it's true.
Essentially would get leniency or forgiveness. Well, who are they supposed to surrender to? It just, again, so no, I don't see much in the way of a strategy. And I think the challenge for the administration moving forward is to try to put ends and means in greater balance. And unfortunately, I keep coming back. I think the way to mainly do that, since we've put aside diplomacy, there's nothing new on the economic side, is to reduce the scale of our goals. And that's where I think we are. But just to be complicated here, sorry, John, if one of our goals, though, is now war termination.
Elites love to be complicated because it shows that they are sophisticated and they are nuanced. Now, something that just came to me over the weekend was that every event requires fuel, right? Fires need fuel. If you remove those ingredients, you cannot have a fire. So everything that captures the news requires fuel. And I think this is just a great framework for understanding reality. Right? What is the fuel that is necessary for something to happen? Right? Big events are just not explosions from nowhere. Right? They are fires that have been accumulating combustible material for years. Then a spark arrives. Observers focus on the spark because that's dramatic, but the real story is the fuel. Political crises work the same way. Right? A protest does not become a revolution unless there is fuel. Say, economic decline, elite division, weak security forces, a mobilized population. Without those ingredients, the protest burns out quickly. Wars spread the same way. They expand only when there are actors with the capability and the incentives and the tolerance for risk. Those elements are missing. The war hits natural boundaries, even if the rhetoric sounds apocalyptic. Financial crashes follow the same pattern. You might have a single bank failure, you might have an asset collapse, but the fuel is the leverage, the speculative bubble, the fragile balance sheets that have built up for years. Pandemic, right? A virus becomes a global event only under certain circumstances. So instead of asking what caused this event, you ask what made this possible. Instead of asking why did this happen now, you ask what conditions were in place for this to happen now. So when you start looking for fuel, all these shocking events become easier to understand. Right? The fall of the Soviet Union looks sudden, but the fuel was decades of economic stagnation, ideological exhaustion, and nationalist pressure. The Arab Spring looked spontaneous, but it required fuel. And looking for the fuel explains why many predicted disasters never happen, because if the fuel is missing, the spark dies. So journalists tend to focus on sparks. They should focus on fuel.
The issue then is not simply what is it we destroy, but what is it other than pain do we offer to the Iranians to induce them to agree to terminate the war? So my guess is, as awkward as this sounds, it's quite possible the administration is going to have to think about one, not continuing to attack Iranian leadership. If you want to end the war, you got to have somebody to end it with. Second of all, what happens if the Iranians say we demand this in the way of sanctions relief? Or we come back to some of the negotiations about which there's great questioning about how Messrs. Witkoff and Kushner handled them. What if the Iranians say, we'll end it if you agree to this on the nuclear side or what have you? So it's quite possible that the administration is going to find itself in a very awkward situation sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think the clock favors the Iranians, does it not?
Again, as awkward as that is to agree with, the answer, it does. In a funny sort of way, it favors them in several ways. One is the politics of the United States put more pressure on our quote-unquote regime than arguably the politics of Iran put on theirs. Iran's an authoritarian society. They will continue to repress if they have to. They will continue to kill. They're being attacked. It's an awkward context for opposition to rise up. Well, here you're going to have, I think, increasingly loud opposition, and you can talk to some of the opposition. That's all.
So the Washington Post dominates the intelligence beat, and one of their key columnists is David Ignatius, who often does have valuable things to say, and he also does an awful lot of virtue signaling. So here he is speaking to Charlie Rose.
I think the world is astonished by American boldness or recklessness, depending on how people look at it. I think some of our closest European allies, especially Britain, have been so disturbed by the lack of international support or legal authority for this that they've pulled back, and Trump is furious. So I've never seen a break between the U.S. and Britain quite like what we're seeing now.
So he's a key member of the elite.
It travels. This is a critical moment in the Iranian war of
Yeah, elites love the word critical.
2026 and the future of the Middle East. We will talk about many subjects, including the decision of both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to invade Iran, the factors that will determine its impact.
So David Ignatius, leading narrative setter for the diplomatic establishment for the intelligence industry.
Impact on the country and the Middle East, the possibility of boots on the ground.
Right, so just from the tone, the framing, the phrasing, the words, you know, this is someone left of center with the establishment blob perspective.
Economic consequences for oil prices and future actions by President Trump. This makes it a perfect time to talk with David Ignatius. David, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, Charlie.
You know the Middle East well. How is this for better or worse?
So think of David Ignatius as the linguistic ambassador for the deep state, for the national security state. And he'll point out its flaws, but he'll always say it's better than the alternative.
Worse, going to change it.
Well, so first the better part. The Iranian regime that was embodied.
So he'll always talk about, oh, I just got a text from this high-ranking official. So he uses his proximity to power to make claims about truth, right? I just stopped stepped off the plane and I was just talking to this top official. And so he loves to emphasize his personal connection to power.
Symbolized by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is going to change. I mean, the figurehead is gone. That regime, in all the time I've covered the Middle East, starting in 19...
So you could think of him as the chief astrologer or chief diviner of the national security deep state, right? He interprets the stars of the interagency to tell the sovereign when a decapitation strike is a tactical victory but a strategic gamble. Right? He interprets the death of Khamenei not as a regime change event, but as a fire-and-forget missile strategy that lacks a post-war plan, a plan that is developed and executed by experts. So he tells the sovereign, look, the stars of the Iranian state are mountainous, they're spread out, you have killed the man, but the infrastructure of repression remains. Right? He is the diviner who labels Trump's strategy Viking warfare. And by naming it, he then asserts authority over it, just as I am asserting authority over him by naming him. So he provides the technical alibis for the deep state, for the members of the blob who demand a serious debate. He tells the sovereign that Iran's capacity for martyrdom is a very powerful force that you have underestimated.
1980, the year after the Iranian Revolution, has been a force, in my view, for instability, turmoil, sometimes terrorism, in the Middle East. I have visceral personal memories of that from my time in Lebanon, but I've watched it everywhere else in the region. And if that regime is gone, there is an opening to something different and better.
So his group has a particular vibration, right? It uses incantations very similarly to, say, 3HO.
Moving into the 60s and 70s, cults like Manson Family, Children of God, the People's Temple Church, and the Heaven's Gate started to be...
So cults are high-intensity in-groups, and David Ignatius is also part of a high-intensity in-group.
...become quite famous among the masses, and pretty soon there was a new cult starting in every state of the country. Among many such entities was one called 3HO, an organization that used one of the oldest and most followed religions in the world for its own sick purposes. This is the story of how a cult turned capitalistic corporation hijacked American Sikhism.
So from the outside, David Ignatius' social class looks like a cult, right? It shares the same internal induction methods, the same vibration consistency, the same type of speech, talking about liaison and intelligence liaison files and clandestine tradecraft and degrading capabilities and fragmented and chaotic, right? A whole series of mantras like 3HO. 3HO has its mantras, Orthodox Jews have their mantras, and the National Security Deep State has its mantras too. And when you use the mantra, it shows that you are loyal to this particular cult. So to be a part of David Ignatius's in-group, you must master this speech, this national security series verbal style, right? That is the induction ritual of the deep state. Right? He is the oracle of the deep state. He interprets the stars of American power to tell the sovereign that epic fury is an ill-defined hope. So while the sovereign is rashly declaring victory, David Ignatius provides the sense-making that allows the legacy elite, the blob, to feel like they are the ones who truly understand why wars to erase a regime don't work like that. So David Ignatius does not simply report events. He does not primarily seek truth. He translates the thinking of the most senior members of the blob, the national security bureaucracy, into language that other elites in the blob can digest without feeling panic.
The fear is that this event will add another country to the list of regimes that were blown up and left nothing stable behind, like Libya, like Syria, like Iraq. And I think that's a really frightening prospect. I've been writing and talking with my friends about the importance that the administration think carefully about what kind of Iran is coming in the future and work sensibly to try to enhance.
Yes, I know about Adam Green, No More News. I've been on his show, or he's been on mine, or maybe both. So what do you mean when you say the war is just another psyop? What does that mean specifically? Seems pretty real here. Let's go to Fox News.
Refineries outside of the capital city of Tehran. As you can see here, that black smoke still visible and fires burning during the daytime. Now, one of the reasons the Israelis are able to do this, John, is the U.S. military has supplied about 100 aerial refueling planes. That's twice the number used during Operation Midnight Hammer, which keeps Israeli and American jets flying. In fact, some of them are refueling pretty brazenly over the Persian Gulf with their transponders on. Now, speaking of the Persian Gulf, earlier, Saudi Arabia says an errant bomb dropped from a jet of unknown origin hit a residential neighborhood outside of its capital, Riyadh, killing 2 people and injuring 12. Earlier, President Trump's UN ambassador, Michael Waltz, says if these attacks continue, he expects the Gulf states to strike back.
The Gulf Arabs, who were not so united in recent months around issues like Yemen or Sudan or others, they are absolutely united now. They are incensed, and I expect that you'll see a...
So when you read a column by David Ignatius, it will sound like a policy briefing just translated into journalism language. So he serves the deep state. He serves the foreign policy establishment, and he frames statecraft as a series of necessary but very sober and tragic trade-offs. So he helps to ensure that even when the deep state makes mistakes and their policies fail, they were a result of good intentions. They were calculated risks. It's not an institutional breakdown, right? He prevents elite defection. So he always provides the deep state, the establishment, the foreign policy blob with collective plausible deniability. So he frames its failures as, oh, they missed this or they missed that. They had the best of intentions.
Additional diplomatic and possibly military action from them in the coming days and weeks.
John, the UAE has been Iran's main target. This new Emirati Air Force video shows some of the more than 1,400 Iranian drones being shot down over the Persian Gulf. Over 40% of Iran's drones have been launched here at the UAE, the most of any country in the Middle East, including Israel. And overnight, Iran firing 17 more ballistic missiles and over 100 drones here. All were shot down except for one missile, which splashed down harmlessly into sea, and 4 drones which slipped through. And one of those drones, yesterday, a skyscraper here in Dubai was hit by falling debris after it was shot out of the sky. Pakistan's prime minister now saying 2 Pakistani nationals were killed by that falling debris, not one as originally reported yesterday. It's an update. Now, in Kuwait, an Iranian drone slamming into a government building. 2 workers were injured, according to local reports. As you can see, the fires raging there. And in Dubai, after a drone hit the airport yesterday, flights were briefly suspended but have now resumed on a limited basis by Emirates Airlines, the largest in the Middle East. Now, as far as the war goes, John, if you walked around the streets of Dubai or perhaps went to the Dubai Mall behind me, the largest in the world, you wouldn't even know a war is going on. People going about their business, shopping, looking for watches, doing just relatively just normal things, and nobody appears to be quite concerned. And a lot of the officials around here want to see tourism booming again because hotel occupancy is way down, John.
You mentioned, Lucas, that the UAE has taken the most strikes from Iran. From a military standpoint, why is that?
Part of this geography, John, at its closest point, Iran is only 45...
I would have expected Iran would have devoted more missiles to attacking Israel than what we've seen so far. Heard the word nebbish 4 or 5 times this week after not hearing it in years. Funny how words make their rounds and get popular. Yes, nebbish means someone who's not physically impressive, someone who is nervous and wimpy. So David Ignatius, elite foreign policy correspondent for the Washington Post, he has a very calm, measured, procedural way of speaking and writing. Doesn't tend to use ideological language. Rather, he focuses on process, back-channel diplomacy, elite deliberation, strategic trade-offs, right? It's a tone that signals professionalism and insider knowledge. It reassures his elite audience that the system is competent, that the adults are still managing what's going on, and you may have chaotic events, but David Ignatius will frame them as part of an ongoing strategic conversation. So he performs three key narratives for the blob, foreign policy establishment. He legitimizes strategic ambiguity. Says that decisions have been made, they are careful balancing acts, they're not failures or confusion. He renders policymakers more human, so he turns bureaucrats into relatable actors trying to manage difficult trade-offs, and he introduces gradual policy shifts. So when Washington is prepared to pivot in their strategy, he'll write pieces that outline the reasoning behind the shift. So his columns often act as soft launches for new policy directions.
Miles from the United Arab Emirates. A lot of it is just, it's the model of the UAE that Iran doesn't like. This is probably one of the most free and open countries in the Middle East. It feels almost like Las Vegas with weather like Los Angeles. People are pretty open here, and officials I've spoken to say it's the model that Iran doesn't like. Of course, the United Arab Emirates is a party to the Abraham Accords, one of the few Arab nations that has signed on. But then again, so is Kuwait, who's been hit, is not a party to the Abraham Accords, nor is Saudi Arabia, and they've been taking some incoming as well. But again, John, what I've been told, it's really the model, it's the culture here in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, that Iran doesn't like so much. But really, it also comes down to geography. Most of the projectiles being fired here in Dubai, across the country, which is about the size of South Carolina, are these drones, these Shahed drones. They're short-range drones, John.
All right, Lucas Tomlinson reporting live. Lucas, thanks. President Trump is in Florida today after going to Delaware yesterday for the dignified transfer of 6 U.S. service members.
I've been closely tracking elite opinion on this war, and here's my model. Have you ever taken calculus? So the first derivative in calculus measures the rate of change, but then the second derivative measures the rate of change of that rate of change, right? You want to look, where is there acceleration? So expert opinion is shifting. So initially, the expert opinion was this is going to be an absolute disaster. Then the military success became undeniable. So it then shifted to this is a stunning success, but how will this end? And now the elite consensus is we're in a wide, unpredictable regional conflict. So there was an assumption that gained currency in the early days of this war, that we might have a quick resolution, we might have an immediate regime collapse, and that assumption is dying away right now. So the experts now looking at the second order effects of the campaign. How will this shape the economy? So not nearly as much regime change optimism as you heard in the first 3 days. So now there's much more focus on the dangers to the economy of this war.
Against that. Otherwise, we just create another pile of rubble in the Middle East, I think the problems that we see are so aware of will only be compounded.
Speaking of rubble, what's the status on the ground now and the trajectory?
So my understanding is that we've entered, we're speaking on Friday, in the last probably 2 days, a period of essentially unimpeded air activity by the U.S. and Israel over Iran. Iranian air defenses are gone, which means that the U.S. and Israel don't have to be so careful. The U.S. can use big, heavy bombers, B-52s, B-2s that can drop the enormous ordnance and do a level of destruction.
So elites love assisted suicide. They love dialogue. They love to describe things as fraught. And elites love Dubai. Right? I'm reading all these articles, all this commentary about how awesome Dubai is. Right? Elites seem to love Dubai almost as much as they love assisted suicide and gay marriage. Right? Why? Why is Dubai so important to elites? Because elites value the buffered identity, meaning individual autonomy. Right? Dubai appeals to elites for the same reasons that assisted suicide and gay marriage appeals to them, because Dubai removes friction around personal choice. So gay marriage says adults are free to structure their own relationships without any traditional limits. Assisted suicide says individuals should be free to determine when they die. And Dubai says if you got money and talent, right, you can live, work any way you want without undue burdens of national identity and taxation. And elites just love this amount of autonomy, and they freaking love Dubai. I wasn't expecting that. Dubai says we're neutral. Now, the neutrality may not hold up well as a result of this war, but Dubai proclaims political neutrality, has low taxes, light regulation, residency is easy to obtain for the wealthy, the state doesn't interfere much in lifestyle choices, and the elites just absolutely love Dubai.
Iran that they couldn't before, and so they've gone after the leadership. They've decapitated Iran in terms of leadership, as President Trump himself has said. There's nobody left alive for him to talk to that he knows about. They're destroying Iranian missiles, the factories that produce missiles, the factories that produce drones, the places Iranians think they can hide, the underground the caves that we've seen in some photographs where they have missiles stacked up on launchers. Those are vulnerable. The U.S. knows exactly where they're.
So here's another journalism cliche that I'm spotting. When will it stop? Right? The Financial Times. Trump's war on Iran is spreading. Where does it stop? U.S. allies in the Arab world have been plunged into a conflict that they neither wanted nor consented to. Historian Eugene Rogan on what it means for the Middle East. Right? Since when does reality care whether you consent or want something? Since when does war care whether you consent or want something? Right? Reality does not reconstitute itself, does not reshape itself, does not change itself to fit your consent and your wishes. Right? I will tell you where the war will stop, where there is no more fuel for the war. Right? Fire requires certain things, pandemics require certain things, war requires fuel. No fuel, no fire, no war. Right? This war won't ravage Africa. There's a lack of fuel to go to war in Africa over this. Right? Where does this stop? It's just another media cliche. It sounds analytical. It sounds profound. It's mostly rhetorical. It carries three implicit assumptions that journalists rarely say out loud. It assumes that wars behave like runaway processes. It centers on moral legitimacy rather than reality, and it substitutes expressions of vague anxiety for concrete analysis. Right? Wars expand only when there is fuel for the war to expand. There's military capacity, strategic incentive, political incentives, alliance incentives. Remove this fuel and the expansion will stop naturally. Most regional wars remain limited due to a lack of fuel for an extensive war.
There are, in some ways, it's easier to strike them there than if they were mobile, because our ordnance can penetrate those underground shelters. The Navy is basically gone. So in strictly military terms, you'd have to say that the campaign is going well. In political terms, I think it moves.
Yeah, they have to admit that the war's going well in military terms, but they want to pivot. Political terms. That's the problem. Economic terms. Real danger. It's fraught.
Reserve, but he does say prices are going to come down once this conflict is over. Here's his energy secretary.
Energy markets are massively well supplied right now. In fact, the run-up in prices has nothing to do with any shortage of barrels of oil or natural gas. It's just fear and perception, the unknown, that this could be some long, drawn-out crisis, but it won't be.
The president does not have any public events for the rest of the day. He does have some business here in Doral tomorrow before he heads back to the White House. John?
All right. White House correspondent Aisha Husni, thank you. Let's bring in retired U.S. Army Colonel Joe Bacino, who recently served as communications director for U.S. Central Command.
Great. We have a communications director. I wonder what he has to say. So I'm stunned there have only been 6 American casualties. So I think a key question should be, can Iran kill Americans at scale? Does Iran have the weapons, the capability, the missiles, the drones, right, the expertise to do this? Right? I'm stunned at the lack of American casualties. Right? The war is being fought largely at distance. American bases are heavily defended, and it appears that Iran's retaliatory capacity appears severely degraded. So can Iran kill Americans at scale? Right? If the answer is no, then the strategic balance of the war becomes lopsided. Now, If Iran lands one big hit and kills a large number of Americans, then the situation changes dramatically.
And I'm curious, Joe, your thoughts on the motivations behind the Israeli attacks, as we understand it. Israeli attacks on Iran's infrastructure, up till now, oil infrastructure. Up till now, those had pretty much been left alone. You would think that after the Ayatollahs are gone, if indeed that happens, that the Iranian people are going to need the money from oil sales to try to rebuild their country. So why destroy that infrastructure?
Well, so far the initial objectives here have been met. The U.S. and Israel Defense Forces have destroyed the Navy. There's effectively no Navy for Iran. They've attrited the ballistic missile capability.
So the Israeli Air Force has enjoyed stunning success, right? They are mounting 3 raids a day, right? They are dropping an enormous amount of ordnance, right? They are shattering global standards. And how are they doing it? In part by modafinil. So modafinil is called a stimulant, but it's not a stimulant. It doesn't have the negative side effects of Adderall. It's not addictive. It has no street value. It simply increases wakefulness and paying attention when you don't have enough sleep. And so how is Israel doing this? Right? They are organized. They're on modafinil. This war is a race between the firing and offensive capacity of Iran and Israel. So Israel seems to be destroying Iranian missile launches. Israel seems to be overwhelming Iran's capabilities. Right? Iran seems brittle. America is playing a huge role. Israel must have great intelligence. Iran's not adapting very well. So I wonder why everyone wants to call modafinil a stimulant. It's not a stimulant, but it functions like one. But I've been using modafinil for about 12 years. Very few side effects, nothing significant.
By 90%, drones by 80%. They've devastated 2 echelons of leadership, both in the civilian, the religious leadership with the mullahs and with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So this is the next phase, squeezing out the economy, the energy, and also the drone production facilities of Iran, so they effectively cannot function as any form of governance.
Well, but if you're taking out the oil facilities, you're taking out the income for the people of Iran, who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of what we're doing there, aren't you?
Well, first of all, the people there, the Iranian currency is basically worth nothing. It's basically worth a blank piece of paper prior to this. So now
we're not bombing Iran for the people. We're bombing Iran to further American interests. What a naive question. So I was playing some Mark Halperin earlier, and notice how we use the word predicate. Elites love the word predicate. Elite journalists love the word predicate, right? It's such a fancy word, and it performs various social functions, right? It signals that you're a member of an educated professional tribe, right? Use predicate and framework and parameters and modalities, right? It shows that you have an education. You are part of a professional tribe. So you say the policy is predicated on deterrence. It compresses complex reasoning into a single term. It really means based on, but it also implies a chain of logic behind the statement. So when elites use predicate, they are signaling that a policy rests on all these underlying assumptions and strategic reasoning that they understand, but you probably wouldn't. So instead of saying this strategy depends on the assumption that Iran will negotiate, they'll say strategy is predicated on Iranian willingness to negotiate. So the word is a shorthand for an entire analytical structure. Third, using the word shows that you are serious, you are moral, you are formal, you're analytical, you are professional. You're engaged in careful, nuanced reasoning. You're not using political rhetoric. So if you're competing for credibility within a professional tribe, use predicate and shows that you are serious, and it shows that you're not part of the hoi polloi. It distances you from the populist. So the populist uses simple, direct language, such as built on, based on, depends on. elite discourse prefers abstract language because abstraction creates distance from ordinary speech and distance from ordinary people to show that you are superior. And it becomes a self-reinforcing habit. If most people you know are professionals who use words like predicate, then you'll probably use those words too.
Squeezing out the government's ability to function, the government's ability to continue to hide the mullahs. You know, this regime, the clerical portion of the regime, it's wide, it's deep. They've got secession plan on top of secession plan. They're spread out. They're underground. And so how do you squeeze out that clerical regime? You do that through the energy infrastructure, and you do that through their ability to produce these low-cost, attritable drones and ballistic missiles.
The Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi was on NBC for an interview this morning. He said that Iran is maintaining a strategic partnership with Russia. Now, he didn't go into a lot of detail on that, but it's widely thought that the Russians are helping Iran provide targeting information on U.S. forces and the like. Can you comment on that? Is that likely?
Well, it's continuing. This goes back about 2.5 years. Russia has been assisting the regime with targeting for quite some time here, really for more than 2 years, and that continues. It's not of great effect just because Iran no longer has the means of production or the ballistic missile capability to hold the United States and our bases in the Gulf states or Israel at risk. So there's not much productivity coming out of that partnership, but this is not a new thing. This is something that goes back 2 years. You know, if you remember, Iran sent the Shahed 136 drones, the Shahed drones, into Russia to fire against Ukraine, and now this is a reciprocal support.
So speech and vocal patterns are such an important key for understanding what's really going on. And you'll notice that the vocal affect, the vocal tone of academics is quite different from that of advocates in think tanks. So this is Suzanne Maloney. She is an academic specialist with regard to Iran. Notice the very flat monotone she uses.
Succeeded with Iran, with the JCPOA. They were focused primarily on the nuclear issue. Was there any way, under any set of circumstances, that the Iranians would have included the other areas in a productive negotiation? Ballistic missiles, proxies?
I have a very cynical view about all of this, which is that I believe that the negotiations were primarily a ruse, but that the Iranians understood that as clearly as anyone else did for precisely the reasons that Rob just referenced, that this was not the first time that there had been a process of negotiations underway, and that it, in fact, was intended as a kind of theater in order to keep the Iranians off base as the United States and Israel prepared to strike Iran. They learned that lesson very clearly in June. I think that, you know, given the context for these negotiations, which came only weeks after Tehran had slaughtered its own people in the streets after they came out and demanded.
So you would never choose to listen to someone in such a monotone, in such a flat affect. And so it's another way of demonstrating how elite you are, that she doesn't care if anyone listens to her. By sounding as boring as possible, it's a way of claiming elite status.
Regime change and protests over the course of late December and early January. I have to imagine that the Iranians really weren't caught off guard this time. They obviously wanted to test what might be possible through talks with the Trump administration, because to some extent, the administration appeared to have.
So like other Iran experts, Middle East experts, she's willing to admit that the Trump military strike was a strategic victory. But she wants you to know it was a tactical victory, but it is a strategic gamble. Right? She is a chief diviner of regime durability. So she interprets these military strikes not as a regime-changing event, but as a decapitation that leaves the deeply embedded networks of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard intact. So she, in effect, tells the sovereign, the stars of the clerical state have long been in decline. You have killed the man, but the system is in a state of slow-motion metastasis.
Backed itself into a corner with President Trump's social media posts during the course of the protests in which he promised to rescue Iranian protesters, encouraged Iranians to seize their institutions and to continue to come to the streets, but didn't actually have the assets in the region in order to back up those commitments. It was,
So her social circle shares many of the internal inductions and the vibrations of, say, 3HO. There's a particular dialect, right? Calibrated pressure, interagency brainstorming, setting the theater, symbiotic relationships, right? So these are like the mantras of cults and religious groups. She uses phrases and dialects that serve as a loyalty signal to the blob, to the sober realist elite, right? To be a part of an in-group, you have to master the rhetoric. And she has mastered the rhetoric, and she has mastered the flat monotone.
I think a game from both sides to test what might be possible, but also I think we also can tell from the rapidity of the Iranian response on Saturday after the launch of the initial strikes that they were expecting this.
So from her vocal tone, her emotional tone, her word choice, she wants to emphasize how complex things are. She wants to talk about long-term structural trends, political realism, policy trade-offs. So her element is the policy conference, or she often is quoted in major newspapers. She gives TV interviews. She's on think tank panels like this. She's an expert in Iran's internal politics, economic pressure, the limits of diplomacy. She is an interpreter between different factions of the blob. So you get a pressure strategist like Mark Dubowitz from Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You get the diplomatic negotiator Robert Malley, who is Joe Biden's envoy to Iran. You get the engagement analyst academic Ali Vaez. And then you get this historical realist interpreter, Suzanne Maloney. And each person plays a different role in the blob's ecosystem.
They were prepared to retaliate effectively, immediately, and that, this was a theater that really only just delayed the obvious.
Yeah. All three of you had experience in negotiations. Let me ask this to all.
So all of these people speak the same way. They avoid dramatic predictions because that might show that they're wrong. Right? They won't talk about imminent regime collapse, inevitable war, or diplomatic breakthroughs. They're going to talk in terms of constraints and trade-offs and probabilities. They want to show that they're part of the careful analytical wing of the policy community in the blob. Right? She's an establishment analyst. She provides the historical realism and the intellectual credibility of the mainstream Iran policy debate.
Three of you, admittedly, it's a prejudice, I guess, bias on my point. You can't do these negotiations on the back of a cocktail napkin. And you've got the president's best friend and his son-in-law deployed handling the three incredibly complicated.
So her peer group in the blob shows their intellectual restraint and their analytical neutrality, and they build status through methodical reasoning, the qualification of claims, references to historical cases, acknowledging uncertainty, avoiding emotional language. So the conversation here is calm, it's flat, it's cautious. It signals, I am not an advocate, I am a scholar. So to preserve your academic credibility, you have to appear detached from political agendas. So if you sound urgent or emotional or excited, right, then that harms your professional credibility signal.
Negotiations, all at the same time. In fact, in Geneva, if I'm correct, Ali, I think they saw the Russians after an initial break in the negotiations.
So coming up, Ali says that essentially that Trump is the unwitting agent of Bibi Netanyahu.
Stabilized and a bloody mess.
Right.
Whereas I think the Gulf states cannot, and by extension, I don't believe the United States can sustain that kind of an outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I would assert with great conviction when Donald Trump in his own mind has come to the conclusion that the war is going to end, Bibi's war is going to end as well. because 2026 is a critically important year for this prime minister. If the government goes to term in October or not, I suspect that elections will be moved up to capitalize, frankly, on what I think clear. If there's a winner or loser after a week, it's Benjamin Netanyahu in the winner category. Cemented his relationship with Trump, changed the conversation from Gaza and Palestinians, which is a fraught one to him, to one that most Israelis would agree on, demonstrated the IDF's prowess, its brilliance, killing Sinwar, killing Nasrallah, killing Ali Khamenei. So when Donald Trump says it's over, it's going to be over for Netanyahu as well, because he cannot win without Trump, if he can win. Ali, any thoughts before we move on to Iranian strategy?
Look, I think it's pretty clear, if we want to be honest, that Benjamin Netanyahu finally found a president who wouldn't say no to war with Iran. And in that way, I think Trump has become Bibi's unwitting instrument in this war. But as Suzanne said, I think the ultimate objectives are different, and I agree with you that Trump can pull the plug on this. But the cost of this war, I think, is primarily shouldered by the United States, and so are the consequences. And if I think Trump really thought after the 12-day war that the problem was resolved, he would have been okay with putting it on a back burner for a long period of time. But it was still Israel that was pushing that there is the missile program, that this is a plastic moment in history where we can completely change the map of the Middle East. And Trump finally fell for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that Trump is his witting partner, not his unwitting one. Remember, in June, Netanyahu offered Trump a piece of history, and he took it.
Now, Ali Baez thinks that if Bibi, this canny, wily Jew, he can just convince Donald Trump of anything. A little more skeptical. Another thing that I notice in this rhetoric and discussion is the fetishization of seriousness. Right? The elite love seriousness. They love to criticize and dismiss Donald Trump's team for lack thereof. Now, when you look at the facts on the ground, when you look at the military execution, you couldn't get more serious than this Israeli-American attack. But the elites and the blob, the mainstream media, right, they focus their attacks on the Trump administration for a lack of seriousness in their words, in their rhetoric. To me, what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the military strikes is far more important than a lack of seriousness in memes or rhetoric. But if you talk about seriousness, that shows that you are a professional, that you are elite. So journalists love to say that someone's serious. They mean that someone speaks the language and follows the rituals of the professional governing class. And Trump and his populist nationalist allies violate those rituals. And so they are not serious. Right? Use plain language. If you engage in insults and mockery, if you don't follow the process, if you disregard bureaucratic norms, right? If you appeal to a mass audience, that just shows that you are not serious.
First only American president to strike Iran's nuclear sites without cost or consequence. And I believe Netanyahu offered Trump another piece of history with killing or helping to kill Ali Khamenei. This is Trump's war, and Netanyahu's together. Okay. A question I'm interested in, and Ali, we're going to start with you. The Iranian response so far after a week, it's referred to as horizontal escalation. They can't match the U.S. military directly, but a little bit of their bombs go a long way in making big impacts in places. What is the Iranian strategy a week in, and is it likely to change at all?
Okay, let's leave it there. I'll talk to you later, mate. Bye-bye.